When I was 16, my buddies Mike and Steve convinced me to take on a tough stretch of the Appalachian Trail down in West Virginia. We'd been planning the trip for a while, like 4 or 5 months. We used money from part-time shifts at a grocery store to buy used gear off Craigslist and from a local outlet store. Nothing fancy, just tents, backpacks, and a water filter pump Mike's cousin swore by. My parents weren't excited about it. They made me promise to text whenever we had signal, but after a lot of back and forth, they agreed. I guess they figured I was the most cautious out of the 3 of us. We left early Saturday morning in Mike's dad's pickup, this old, loud Chevy with a crack in the windshield and fast food wrappers all over the floor. The drive took about 3 hours. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was just after sunrise. It was cool and foggy, the kind of weather where the sun breaks through in streaks. We parked near the ranger station and signed in on the trail log, just our first names and expected return time on Monday evening. The first few miles were easy, mostly flat with some light hills. We laughed about dumb stuff from school, like a teacher who always fell asleep during movies. Around noon, we reached a small overlook, ate protein bars, and took pictures on Steve's phone. Cell service dropped out maybe 2 hours in, but we'd expected that. The trail got steeper after that, and we didn't talk as much. Just walked in a line, sweating and breathing heavy. I remember being surprised how quiet the woods were. Not in a peaceful way, more like the silence was pressing in on us. By late afternoon, we found a spot near a stream to camp. It was a little clearing with flat ground and a fallen tree we used as a bench. We set up our tents, filled our bottles from the stream, and made dinner. Those dehydrated pasta meals that you boil in a bag. The sun went down fast in the woods. It was dark by 8. We built a small fire and sat around it, poking at the flames with sticks. Mike started telling stories he claimed were real, but we all knew were made up. Stuff about hikers going missing and being found weeks later with their eyes gone. That kind of thing. By 10, we were turning in. I zipped myself into my tent and fell asleep quick. I remember thinking how quiet it was, even with the stream nearby. Not eerie yet, just unfamiliar. I woke up around midnight, no idea why. At first, I just lay there trying to figure out what pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Not right next to us, but not far either. Maybe 30 or 40 feet, somewhere in the trees. I figured it was a deer or maybe a black bear. We'd seen signs about both at the ranger station, so I stayed still, listening. Then I heard another crack. Then silence. Just as I was starting to drift back off, I heard voices. Low, hushed, not whispering but not loud. I couldn't make out what they were saying. Just the rhythm of words, maybe 3 people talking, close together. They weren't panicked or excited, more like a regular conversation. But who the hell has a chat in the woods after midnight? I unzipped my sleeping bag and leaned on one elbow, trying to hear better. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps. Slow, steady. I sat all the way up. Steve's tent was closest to mine, just a few feet away. His zipper hissed open. He leaned his head out and looked at me. His expression said everything. He'd heard it too. We didn't talk, just stared at each other and listened. The voices were closer now, maybe 20 feet from the tree line. Still not clear enough to understand, but I was sure they weren't drunk hikers or rowdy teenagers. Something about the tone was off. One voice was harsh, like it was scolding. Another one was slower, calmer, but not friendly. I leaned out of my tent and looked toward the trees, but I couldn't see anything. It was just black. Our fire had burned down to faint red coals, barely throwing any light. "Wake Mike up," Steve whispered. I crawled over to Mike's tent and tapped the side. Nothing. I tapped harder. "Mike," I said, just above a whisper. "Wake up, man." He He groaned. "What?" "Just get up," I said. "There's people out here." He sat up fast. "What do you mean?" Steve was out of his tent now, crouched near the fire pit. He held the small camp axe we'd brought for cutting kindling. It looked stupid in his hand, short and dull, like it belonged in a garage, not out here. The voices were louder. I could hear them clearly now. A man said, "He went this way." Then someone else, "You sure?" That kid lied. A third voice replied, "Doesn't matter. We'll find it." My heart dropped. That wasn't normal. Those weren't hikers. Those were people looking for someone, or something, and they were pissed. Steve motioned for us to kill the rest of the fire. I stomped on the coals with my boot, smothering them in dirt. Now it was pitch dark. We crouched in the middle of our camp, not talking. The voices were on the trail, maybe 10 feet from where we'd set up. Mike whispered, "We should run." Steve shook his head. "They'll hear us." "They already heard us," I said. We didn't move, just crouched there, trying not to breathe too loud. A flashlight beam swept across the trees, maybe 30 feet away. Then another. They weren't trying to stay hidden anymore. One of the voices said, "There, I see something." When I peered out of our tent flap, I saw them. 4 shadowy figures moving slowly but deliberately toward our camp. Their outlines were uneven, hunched. They weren't carrying backpacks or walking sticks. One of them had something long in his hand, maybe a crowbar or a rifle. I couldn't tell in the dark. Another had a large sack over his shoulder. They moved like they weren't in a hurry, like they already knew we weren't going anywhere. One of them stepped up to the fire pit and kicked it hard, scattering cold ashes and charred wood. The faint red glow was completely gone now. Another man crouched and picked up our water filter. He held it up like it was some strange object, then tossed it into the woods. I heard it crash against a tree and disappear into the brush. The voices were louder now, clearer. Slurred speech, heavy breaths, and cruel laughter. "City kids," one of them said. "Think this is a damn park." Another one answered, "They don't belong here. This is our mountain." Then they laughed, loud, open-throat laughs that didn't sound amused. They sounded like warnings. They started rummaging through the food bag we'd hung from a low branch. One ripped it down and spilled the contents onto the ground. "What's this? Granola bars? You boys bring snacks?" Mike grabbed my arm so hard I almost yelped. I could feel Steve beside me, frozen stiff. None of us could speak. None of us moved. We were stuck in this thin layer of nylon with nowhere to go. We couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't hide. I didn't know if they saw our tents or knew we were inside, but it was only a matter of seconds before they did. Then the mood shifted. One of them kicked at the stakes of our tent. The fabric shook. Another slammed something, maybe a boot, into the side. "Come out, boys," someone shouted. "We got something to show you." They were getting worked up now. Another voice said something about teaching lessons. I heard the metallic clack of a weapon being moved, maybe a rifle. Then I saw the barrel press into the side of the tent near Mike. The man behind it laughed and jabbed it again. "Hey, you decent in there?" The stench hit me next. Alcohol and something bitter and sharp, like engine cleaner or fuel. It made my eyes water. They weren't just drunk. They were messed up on something else. And they weren't just playing around. This wasn't some scare the tourists stunt. Steve was breathing fast, little gasps. I wanted to tell him to stop, to slow down. But there wasn't time. These men were loud, angry, and completely unpredictable. I started connecting the dots. This wasn't just backwoods aggression. They were probably up to something illegal out here. Poaching, cooking meth, something that made them paranoid enough to hunt down kids with tents. Then the zipper started to move. One of them was unzipping our tent. I grabbed Steve and Mike. "Back of the tent," I whispered, barely moving my lips. "Now." We shuffled backward as quietly as we could. I pulled out the small folding knife from my pocket and slashed at the back wall of the tent. Nylon tore fast. The sound felt so loud, but they didn't notice. They were still arguing about whether to drag us out or set the whole thing on fire. We slipped out one by one into the brush. Our boots crunched leaves. I winced every time. But the men stayed focused on the front of the tent. We circled around the camp, low to the ground, ducking under branches. Steve tripped once but didn't cry out. We made it to where we'd hung our packs and sleeping bags and grabbed what we could. Mike left behind his bedroll. I dropped the camp stove. None of it mattered. We ran. Not like sprinting. More like stumbling, blind, pushing branches out of the way and trying not to fall. We didn't use flashlights. Didn't speak. Just kept moving. Behind us, I thought I heard someone yell, but I wasn't sure if it was real or in my head. We moved like that for hours. Maybe 6. Maybe more. The trail was hard to follow in the dark. Sometimes it disappeared entirely. We slipped in mud, tore skin on thorns, and crossed cold streams without stopping. Our legs burned. My shirt was soaked through with sweat and dew. Every snapping twig sounded like boots behind us. We didn't stop until the sky turned gray-blue. The trees started to glow with early light. Then we saw it. A small wooden building with a solar panel on top, and an American flag nailed to the side. A ranger station. We didn't knock. We just opened the door and walked in like 3 ghosts. The ranger inside looked up from his desk, saw us, and stood up immediately. He didn't ask questions at first, just gave us water and radioed someone. After 10 minutes, he asked what happened. We told him everything. His face changed. He nodded a lot, said he believed us. "You're lucky," he said. "We've been watching a few guys who live up that way. Poachers. One of them used to work at a distillery, learned how to run a still off the books. He said they'd been trying to pin them for a while, but it was hard. No one wanted to report anything. Locals were scared of them. Most hikers didn't come out that deep anyway. He called our parents, said we were okay, just shaken up. Drove us back to the trailhead where Mike's dad's truck was parked. We didn't talk much on the way. A week later, Mike texted us a link to a local news article. 4 men arrested for illegal wildlife activity, possession of unregistered weapons, and threatening behavior toward park visitors. No names in the article, but the ranger confirmed it later. It was them. He told us we did the right thing. I still hike sometimes, but I don't camp in deep woods anymore unless I talk to a ranger first. Ask what's going on in the area. Ask if anyone's been acting strange. Some places look peaceful on a map, but they belong to people who don't follow the same rules the rest of us do. When I was 31, my old friend Jeff convinced me to hike a part of the Appalachian Trail down in Virginia. We'd been into hiking back in college, even did some serious multi-day treks, but life got in the way after we graduated. Jobs, family stuff. We hadn't done anything like this in years. Jeff was in the middle of a messy divorce and needed a break. I thought it might help clear his head, and maybe we'd both get something out of it. We met up on a Friday night, grabbed a room at a rundown motel just off the highway. It smelled like cigarettes even though it was marked non-smoking, but we were too tired to care. We set our alarms and tried to sleep early. We hit the trail by 7 a.m. Saturday. The plan was to do about 15 miles in 2 days. Nothing too crazy, but enough to feel it. We had a shelter spot reserved for Saturday night, and if we kept a steady pace, we'd be back to the car by mid-afternoon Sunday. The trailhead was quiet, just a couple other cars in the lot. It was a cool, dry morning. Everything was green, and birds were going off like an alarm clock in the woods. We were both out of shape. Not even a mile in, we were wheezing and having to pause every 20 minutes or so to catch our breath. We weren't carrying heavy packs either, just basic gear, food, water, and sleeping bags. Still, our legs weren't used to the incline. Our shirts were soaked by the second hour. Jeff laughed it off and said, "We used to fly through this stuff." I just nodded, focused on pacing myself. We didn't talk much that morning. The trail twisted through thick patches of trees and opened occasionally to narrow ledges overlooking valleys. Some parts were muddy, some rocky. My thighs were already sore by the time we hit the halfway point. Around 11, we passed a couple going the opposite direction. They looked fresh and cheerful, waved politely, said something about the shelter being in good shape. Jeff asked if they'd seen any bears. They laughed and said, "Just squirrels." The trail got steeper after that, and the trees closed in more. No cell service. We kept going uphill until we hit a small clearing with a good view of the next ridge. By noon, we'd barely covered 4 miles. We stopped at a rocky outcrop that overlooked a wide, wooded valley. There was a ledge big enough for both of us to sit down. I pulled out my sandwich, ham and cheese wrapped in foil, and Jeff had a peanut butter bagel. We took our time eating. The air was still, just the occasional bird call or rustling branch. After a while, I leaned back against my pack and let the sun hit my face. I started to feel a little more like the guy I'd been 10 years ago, not the one stuck at a desk all week. Jeff looked calmer too, staring off toward the other ridge. Neither of us said much. Then we heard shouting. At first it was faint, just voices echoing off the trees, maybe a couple people yelling or playing around. Jeff paused mid-bite, listening. "You hear that?" I nodded. The sound was coming from somewhere below us, past the ridge. It didn't sound angry, more like excited, laughing maybe. Then the tone changed. One voice got louder. It didn't sound fun anymore. Someone yelled, "Help!" loud and clear. Then again, more desperate, "Help me!" Jeff stood up quickly, shielding his eyes and trying to look across the valley. The echo made it hard to place the direction exactly. The sound bounced around in the trees. "It's coming from that way," he said, pointing off to the right, past a thicket of brush. I shoved my trash into my pack and stood up. The shouting kept going, but now it was mixed with rustling and a few short screams. It was clearly someone in trouble. No way it was a joke. We looked at each other, and Jeff said, "We gotta go." We moved fast. There was no trail going in that direction, so we had to cut through dense underbrush. The brush was thick and scratchy, branches grabbing at our sleeves. I nearly tripped twice on roots. The ground sloped down, not steep but uneven, and we had to keep balancing ourselves as we pushed through. The shouting went on for another minute, maybe 2, and then just stopped. No more words, no rustling, nothing. That silence made us move even faster. Jeff was ahead, swatting branches out of the way, checking every few steps to see if we were still going the right direction. The further we went, the more the ground dropped into a narrow gully. We passed a broken log and a few scattered beer cans. Someone had been here recently. Jeff called out once, "Hello?" But there was no answer. We kept going. The trees started thinning out again as we neared the base of the ridge. Then we saw something lying across a patch of mossy ground about 20 yards ahead. When we reached the edge of the cliff, the place where the voices had come from, We saw gear scattered across the rock. A coiled rope, 2 carabiners, one with some dirt on it, and a small red backpack lying open with a crushed energy bar inside. There were scuff marks near the edge, like someone had slipped or been dragged. Jeff went straight to the edge, crouched down, and leaned over carefully. His whole face changed. He looked back at me and shook his head. I moved closer and looked for myself. About 60 feet down, there was a narrow ledge sticking out of the cliff face. 2 bodies lay crumpled there, motionless. They were wearing bright climbing helmets and had harnesses still attached. Their ropes were wrapped around a small patch of brush and a dead tree, tangled and slack. One of the helmets had a crack in it. I shouted down, "Hey, can you hear me?" But nothing moved, not even a twitch. Jeff stood back up slowly, looking sick. "They're not moving," he said. He pulled out his phone to call for help, but of course no bars. We tried walking a few feet up the trail, holding the phones up. Nothing. We had a basic GPS unit, but no satellite messaging. We stood there, just staring down at those 2 people. The gear was still warm when I touched it. One glove had fallen near the rope pile. We'd heard them yelling not even an hour ago. I said I'd stay while Jeff hiked back toward the main trail to get a signal. He agreed and handed me one of the walkie-talkies from his pack, just in case. I sat down on the flat rock, watching the ledge, waiting for something to move. Jeff disappeared into the brush, back the way we came. I stayed there for hours. The sun moved lower and shadows stretched across the valley. I marked the GPS location and wrote the time on a notepad from my pack. Every 15 minutes or so, I called down again, but nothing changed. I studied the ropes. Looked like they'd been trying to ascend the face from the bottom. The knots looked clean, professional, but one of the bolts near the edge had pulled clean out. It lay nearby, rusted at the tip. It didn't take much imagination to figure out what happened. They probably trusted that anchor, maybe transferred weight to it, and it just gave. Once the anchor failed, they'd have fallen hard. There were scuff marks on the rock near the edge, like someone tried to stop the fall. Maybe the second climber slipped trying to help. I didn't know. The quiet got heavy after a while. I heard a woodpecker somewhere far off. The wind picked up, cold and steady. I zipped up my jacket and kept checking my watch. Jeff had been gone a long time. I started worrying that he'd gotten hurt or lost. I had no way to contact him. I thought about trying to climb down myself, but knew I wasn't in shape or trained for that. Around late afternoon, I finally heard movement, branches snapping and voices. I stood up and saw figures through the trees. Jeff came first, his face red from hiking fast, followed by 2 uniformed park rangers and a pair of rescue techs carrying gear. One of them asked, "Are they down there?" I pointed to the ledge. They dropped their packs and started setting up ropes without another word. The rangers looked serious, methodical. One of them knelt and checked the old anchor bolt, shaking his head. We stepped back as the rescue guys rigged their ropes. One of them went over the side while the other stayed up top feeding slack. They worked like they'd done this 100 times. In about 10 minutes, the climber reached the ledge and confirmed what we already knew. He radioed up. 2 victims, both deceased. No pulse, no response. Jeff sat down beside me, quiet. We didn't say much. The rangers asked us to recount everything we'd heard and done. We gave times, direction, everything. I showed them the GPS logs. It took them 2 more hours to recover the bodies. They used stretchers and a pulley system. At one point they had to reposition because a tree was in the way. The victims were a man and woman in their late 30s. Their gear looked professional, well maintained. When the bodies were brought up, One of the rangers covered them immediately. He said they were from Colorado, a married couple. They'd signed into a trail register down by the southern lot 2 days earlier. There was no note left at their car. The backpack on the cliff had IDs inside. After things calmed down, one of the rangers said this section of cliff had a reputation. Unstable rock, a few bad falls over the years. No official warning signs, but the climbing community knew to be cautious. He said he'd seen people with decades of experience fall because of shifting stone or a bad anchor. This couple had climbed tougher routes before. Probably thought this one would be a simple weekend climb. By the time the rescue crew started packing up, it was nearly dark. They offered to escort us back, but Jeff said we were okay to hike out alone. We retraced our steps, using headlamps to follow the trail. It felt colder, like the trees had gotten closer. We didn't talk much, just walked. The air was damp. The ground felt uneven, even where it had been smooth earlier. It took us 2 hours to get back to the car. We sat inside without starting it for a few minutes, just trying to shake it off. On the drive home, we barely said a word. I kept seeing the cracked helmet in my head, the way their bodies had been twisted like dolls. We never went back to that trail. Didn't hike again for nearly 2 years. And even then, it was only day hikes, nothing high or risky. I still think about that day, about how random it felt. They were skilled, smart people, just unlucky. The mountain didn't care. It never does. It happened last summer when I was updating topographic data for a section of the Appalachian Trail near Blue Ridge. I work as a cartographer for a surveying company, and this kind of solo fieldwork was routine for me. I'd done similar jobs dozens of times before, sometimes in pairs, but often alone, so this didn't seem any different at first. I had my usual set of tools: GPS unit, digital compass, laser rangefinder, and satellite communicator. The project was focused on a remote stretch of trail that hadn't been officially mapped in over 15 years, which meant a lot of rechecking old data and placing updated markers. I left early Tuesday morning, arriving at the trailhead around 6:30 a.m. There were only 2 cars in the parking lot besides mine. I noted them mentally in case I ran into other hikers along the way, but I didn't expect much company. The weather was clear, mid-70s, low humidity, no rain in the forecast. I loaded my gear into a frame pack, strapped on my water bladder, double-checked the battery levels on everything, and started out. I planned to spend 3 full days collecting data, and I packed food and supplies for at least 5, just to be safe. I also brought a tent, a roll mat, and emergency flare in case things went sideways. The first couple of hours were smooth. I was moving south along the ridge, following old trail markers and logging new coordinates. Every few hundred feet I'd stop, use the laser to map surrounding terrain, and punch it into my tablet. At some points, the trail dipped into denser forest, where tree cover blocked satellite lock for a minute or two. But it always came back. Around 11 a.m., I stopped for a quick snack and logged my position on the digital map. Everything lined up with what I'd planned. I was moving slower than expected due to elevation gain, but nothing unusual. Around noon, I started noticing something odd. My GPS was showing the exact same coordinates it had shown about an hour earlier. I thought I must have forgotten to save a point, or maybe pressed the wrong button, so I rechecked the last 5 entries. They were all logged, and the timestamps looked right. I reset the GPS and waited for it to reacquire signal. The screen flickered a little longer than usual before locking onto satellites. Then it refreshed, and still showed the same spot. I frowned but chalked it up to momentary interference. Maybe the tree canopy was thicker than I realized. I kept going. About 20 minutes later, I passed a dead tree split clean down the middle. Its bark had peeled back like paper from lightning damage. I remembered it clearly because I'd taken a photo of it earlier for the report. A little farther on, I stepped over a small creek that ran shallow and clear across the trail. Same flat stones in the water, same curve in the trail right after. I paused, looked back, then checked my GPS again. Still said I was making progress. According to it, I'd moved about 0.8 miles south from my last stop. But everything looked too familiar. I walked another 15 minutes and reached a curved rock formation shaped like a crescent moon. I'd already scanned it that morning. That wasn't a coincidence. Either I'd made a huge circle without noticing, or my GPS was off by more than a mile. I stood still, switched off the unit, then powered it back on. This time, it failed to pick up a satellite signal for almost 3 minutes. When it finally updated, it showed a location nearly identical to the last 5 readings. No change in elevation, no lateral movement. I opened the compass app. Its arrow spun slowly in a circle, not pointing to any fixed direction. I stepped off the trail a bit and set up the laser rangefinder to double-check topographic points. I aimed it at a known object, a tree with survey tape from the morning, and checked the distance. The reading said 53 meters. I checked the same spot again, and it read 67. That didn't make sense. I tried a different tree. The reading fluctuated again. At first I thought the batteries were dying, but I'd just charged everything overnight. My backup batteries showed full. Still, I replaced them. The errors continued. By now, I felt like I couldn't trust any of my gear. I decided I needed a physical reference, something I could actually see. I pulled out a roll of orange surveyor's tape from my pack and started tying strips to trees every 100 yards. I marked them low on the trunk so they'd be visible but not too obvious to passing hikers. I walked on, counting steps and estimating distance. 100 yards, tie a ribbon. Another 100, tie again. I worked like that for over an hour, checking behind me each time to confirm the trail of bright markers. After 8 ribbons, I stopped for water and looked back down the trail. Through the trees, I could see the last 5 markers clearly. I felt a little better. Even if the GPS kept lying to me, I had a reliable trail to follow. I took a few pictures of the setup and saved them with timestamps on my phone. Then I moved forward again, trying to focus on collecting whatever data I could manually. My tablet still worked fine, so I began recording slope angles, soil type, and general observations by hand. I stopped looking at the GPS. About half an hour later, I looked up and saw one of the orange ribbons tied to a pine tree ahead of me. It was hanging just above eye level, same knot I always made. Quick wrap and a pull-through loop. I stared at it for a moment, then checked the tree bark. I'd scratched a small line into the side of the trunk earlier, just to test laser range. Same mark, same tree. I was back where I started. By the end of the first day, I'd tied more than 30 strips of orange tape, but the trail kept playing tricks on me. I'd walk for an hour, mark trees as I went, and then suddenly see the same markings ahead again. I thought maybe I'd doubled back somehow, maybe taken a side trail without realizing, so I checked my GPS. It claimed I was still heading south, moving away from the trailhead, but I didn't feel like I was going anywhere. The terrain kept repeating. Same sharp turn with exposed roots, same moss-covered boulder, same fallen tree with bark peeling like skin. By sunset, the trail was too dark to keep working. I set up camp on a small flat patch next to a dry creek bed. I tried to brush off the confusion. Maybe I'd just been walking in circles due to some optical illusion. Or maybe I was more tired than I realized. I forced down a meal bar, drank some water, and crawled into my tent. The night was quiet. No wind, no insects, just stillness. I lay awake listening, but heard nothing. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I packed up and tried again. Sun was shining. I chose a landmark, a distinctive split tree I'd seen the day before, and marched in the opposite direction. I marked the trail again, only to see the same orange ribbons an hour later. My GPS beeped regularly, claiming steady progress, but I was staring at my own handwriting on a piece of tape I'd tied the day before. I checked the satellite communicator. No signal. Compass, still spinning like it was magnetized from all sides. I climbed onto a nearby rock outcrop to try for a better signal. Still nothing. I wasn't even deep in the woods anymore, just somewhere off the ridge trail. I tried to talk myself through it logically. Maybe my gear had been damaged. Maybe I had messed up the coordinates. Maybe I'd looped around without realizing. But the surroundings didn't support that. I wasn't walking in circles. I was walking straight. Still, somehow, I was stuck. It was like the trail itself was folding in on me. Wednesday afternoon, I stopped taking coordinates. The gear wasn't helping anymore. I started keeping direction by sun and shadow. I marked trees low, high, on the backside. Still, I saw repeats. Orange tape on trees I hadn't touched, tied too high, or in double knots I didn't use. I sat on a rock and stared at a ribbon I didn't remember tying. It was clean and straight, like it had been placed that morning. I tried sleeping again that night, but I kept hearing things. The wind moved through the trees wrong. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps on leaves. Once I sat straight up, convinced I'd heard my name whispered nearby. Nothing there. Just dark trees and silence. By Thursday morning, I was scared. I hadn't made any real progress. My water was down to 1 bottle and my mouth was constantly dry. I checked my GPS logs. They said I'd moved just under 3 miles since Tuesday, but the recorded waypoints didn't make any kind of path. They zigzagged wildly in all directions. I studied the map, trying to find patterns, but there were none. Just data chaos. I kept walking. I didn't care where. I just wanted out. The trail ahead had more ribbons, some mine, some not. I started seeing knots tied in loops I'd never use, even colors I didn't bring. A red one, maybe faded pink, nailed into a tree trunk. That wasn't mine. Around noon, I noticed the sun was in the wrong place. I'd been heading west by guess, but the sun looked like it was north. Or maybe I was wrong. I hadn't slept. I hadn't eaten much. My skin felt hot and cold at the same time. I saw someone standing ahead for a split second, but when I looked directly, there was only a tree. Voices started up again. Sometimes far off, sometimes close. Always saying my name. I heard snapping twigs like something walking parallel to me in the brush. I tried to ignore it. Kept going. I fell twice that afternoon. Once down a shallow ravine, scraped up my leg. I stopped caring about the tape. I just wanted to find a way out. I walked until my legs stopped listening. I sat down by a tree and closed my eyes. Next morning, I woke to noise, distant chopper blades and barking dogs. I barely had the strength to stand. I grabbed a stick and waved it, shouting until my throat cracked. The dogs found me first, then the search crew. They said I looked pale, sunburned, and severely dehydrated. I couldn't remember what day it was. They helped me walk. A paramedic gave me water while another took my vitals. I asked where I was. He said I was only about 3 miles from the trailhead. I blinked at him. That wasn't possible. I'd been walking for days. They carried me out on a stretcher. I didn't resist. I just stared at the trees above. At the station, they ran tests. Said I had moderate heat exhaustion, mild sunstroke, dehydration. Explained the hallucinations, the confusion. Said it was normal under those conditions. My supervisor had called in the search team after I missed my Wednesday check-in. He met me at the ranger post and told me I'd probably gotten turned around in a dense area. That GPS failures were rare, but not impossible. I nodded but didn't answer. 2 days later, I went back with the crew to collect my gear. They hiked me to the point they found me. Everything was where I left it. My tent, pack, gear, undisturbed. But then we saw the ribbons. Every piece of orange tape was still there, but arranged in a perfect circle around the campsite. Each ribbon exactly 50 feet from the next, strung between trees like someone had planned it out with a measuring tape. No overlap, no clutter, just a clean geometric ring, too precise to be random. One of the rescuers asked if I'd done that. I didn't answer. Back at the office, I pulled the data from my GPS. It showed over 40 miles of walking, but all of it within the same small area, overlapping again and again. My logs had timestamps that didn't match the sunlight I remembered. Some points were duplicated 6 or 7 times in a row. The doctors said trauma can mess with memory. They said I probably panicked and got lost, that I was seeing things because my body was breaking down. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw. I know how long I walked. I know how it felt. I'm not going back. When I was 22, my college roommate Rachel and I decided to spend a weekend hiking through some lesser-known trails in the Pennsylvania section of the Appalachians. It was late summer, and we'd both been stuck in our cubicle jobs for months since graduation. I worked as a billing assistant at a dental clinic. Rachel did admin work at some nonprofit. We were bored and restless, craving something different. Rachel had found old mining maps online, showing trails through parts of coal country that hadn't been maintained in decades. The idea of walking through a half-forgotten, abandoned place was too cool to pass up. It sounded like something we'd talk about for years, so we packed up and drove out on a Friday after work. The campground we found was part of a state park, about 4 hours from where we lived. We got there a little before sundown and pitched a small tent close to a tree line. There weren't many other people there, maybe 2 or 3 tents scattered near the main lot, but it felt safe. We grilled hot dogs over a little fire pit, shared a 6-pack, and went over the map with headlamps. Some of the trails Rachel had marked went through old mine areas, unmarked roads, half-crumbled rail lines, even something she thought might have been a processing site. I told her it sounded a little sketchy, but she grinned and said, "That's the fun of it. We'll see something nobody else has seen in years." A park ranger walked by while we were packing up for the night and warned us about those old mining trails. Said the ground could be unstable or filled with hidden junk, and some of the roads hadn't been checked for decades. We nodded politely, thanked him, and promised to stick to the safer paths. But we both knew we were going off trail in the morning. The next day, after a quick breakfast, we left the main trail about 2 miles in. It wasn't hard to spot the old road Rachel had circled on the map. It was a narrow, rocky path that dipped down into the trees. The forest around us looked untouched, but the trail was still clear enough to follow. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no bugs, just the crunch of our boots and the rustling of trees in the breeze. We saw broken down metal equipment covered in moss, slabs of concrete half buried in dirt, and bits of old rails rusting in place. I remember stepping over a thick metal cable that had snapped and was just lying across the trail like a snake. At first, it felt like a ghost town had been swallowed by the woods. Rachel kept pointing out pieces of machinery. "That's probably an old coal cart. I think that used to be a hoist." It was weird, yeah, but interesting. Like walking through the bones of some long-dead machine. We didn't talk much, just took pictures and kept moving. About an hour in, we started seeing newer trash. An empty beer can lying in a fire pit that still had ash in it. A crumpled ramen packet. Even a plastic grocery bag half filled with something we didn't bother checking. It all looked recent, like someone had been out there not more than a week or two ago. I said something like, "Maybe people use this spot to camp," and Rachel just shrugged. I didn't like how the trash was spread around. It didn't look like a normal campsite. There was no order to it, just bits of garbage scattered along the path, some of it off in the brush like it had been thrown or dropped in a hurry. We kept walking, but now we were paying closer attention to what was around us. I noticed a tree with what looked like a torn t-shirt hanging from one of the lower branches. It was dark gray, stained, and shredded on one side like it had caught on something. I stopped and pointed it out. Rachel stared at it for a second, then said, "Could be nothing." But her voice sounded different. She wasn't grinning anymore. A few minutes later, we found another fire pit. This one bigger. Someone had made a circle of rocks in a clearing maybe 30 feet off the trail. There were burned logs, beer bottles, and a blackened pan lying on its side. Rachel crouched and picked up a half-burnt stick. "Still damp," she said. "That means someone's been here, like, really recently." I just nodded. I didn't want to say what I was thinking. This didn't feel like some backpacker's hangout. It felt more like someone had been living out here for a while, and they weren't trying to clean up after themselves. We kept moving, slower now. The air felt heavier. We passed a spot where a log had been dragged across the trail, like a makeshift bench or maybe a barrier. We stepped over it and kept going, but both of us were looking around more. I kept thinking I heard movement in the trees, but every time I stopped to listen, there was nothing. The trail curved around a steep ridge, and on the other side, there was a small clearing. In the center was a blue tarp strung between two trees. It wasn't very big, maybe the size of a small tent, and under it were a few plastic tubs, a backpack, and a rolled-up sleeping bag. No one was there, but it looked like they'd just stepped away for a moment. Rachel stopped so suddenly I almost walked into her. "We should turn around," she said. I didn't argue. We both started walking back the way we came, faster this time, not running, but not taking our time either. The trees looked different now, like they were closing in tighter. I glanced behind us a few times, expecting to see someone coming down the trail, but there was nothing. No sound but our boots and the wind. When we reached the spot where the shredded shirt had been hanging, it was gone. About an hour deeper into the mining area, we heard a bark. Just one at first. It echoed through the trees, sharp, distant, but definitely a dog. Not a coyote or wolf, not some wild call. A real bark, familiar but out of place. Rachel turned her head toward the sound, raised an eyebrow and said, "Probably someone hunting." I nodded but didn't answer. Then another bark came from a different direction. Then two more, overlapping each other. The sound bounced around the old mining cuts and overgrown pits like it was coming from everywhere. We kept walking, slower now, ears up. The trees were getting thicker again, and we were moving uphill. The air smelled like wet leaves and metal. I didn't say it out loud, but I was starting to think we weren't alone out here. And not in a friendly hikers nearby kind of way. Rachel was quiet too. Her jaw was clenched, and she kept checking behind us every few minutes. We found an old wooden platform that must have been part of a mining structure. It was leaning but solid enough to climb. From the top, we could see more of the valley. That's when I spotted movement in the trees, quick, low, and fast, then more. 6 or 7 dogs, spread out, weaving through the brush like they were tracking something. Medium-sized, but fast and alert. One looked like a lab mix, another maybe a pit. The others were harder to tell, but none looked healthy. Their fur was patchy, ribs visible, eyes scanning constantly. They didn't move like pets. They moved like something hunting. The barking stopped all at once. Like someone had hit mute. The silence dropped heavy around us. I realized that whatever those dogs were chasing, they'd either found it or they'd picked up a better scent. Us. We didn't talk. We climbed down fast and headed back the way we came. But the trail wasn't clear anymore. Everything looked different, like the trees had shifted behind us. Rachel kept glancing at her phone, but the GPS had frozen. I checked mine. No signal, no map, just blank. Then they were there. We spotted them on the ridge above us, standing still, ears perked, eyes locked onto us. The German Shepherd mix was in front. Its face was scarred, and one ear was torn. It let out one low growl and started down the slope. The others followed, moving together, slow and sure. "Run," Rachel said. We didn't waste time. We pushed through the trees, not even trying to find the trail anymore. Everything became noise, branches cracking, leaves underfoot, our breathing ragged and loud. And behind us, the dogs. Barking now, fast and hard, with high-pitched yelps mixed in. It wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, like they knew what they were doing. I could hear them flanking us, one getting close on the left, then another crashing from the right. Rachel tripped once but got back up. We didn't stop. My side was on fire, and my boots were slipping on the wet ground. We crossed an old drainage ditch, nearly falling into it. The forest was getting denser. Then I saw a flash of silver. Fence. We almost ran into it full speed. Chain link, 6 feet tall, wrapped around what looked like an old storage yard. We ran alongside it looking for a break. The dogs were behind us, maybe 50 feet away now, snarling and barking again. I could hear them crashing into the undergrowth. Rachel pointed ahead. There! A section had been cut open, maybe by other hikers or animals. We ducked through, scraping our arms, and landed hard on the other side. It opened up into a clearing, and that's when we saw the truck. It was parked near a rusted gate, white with green stripes. Forest Service. A man in a ranger uniform was leaning into the truck bed, sorting gear. He looked up, saw us, and his face went serious immediately. "Hey, what's going on?" he shouted, stepping forward. "Dogs," I gasped. "A pack. They're chasing us." Rachel pointed back toward the gap in the fence. The ranger, his name tag said Dave, moved fast. He pulled something from the cab and stood between us and the fence. The dogs reached the fence seconds later. The German Shepherd was first, followed by the others. They didn't try to get through the hole, just stood there pacing, teeth bared, barking and growling. One of them slammed its body against the wire but backed off when Dave shouted. He waited until they stopped pressing forward, then waved us toward the truck. We climbed in the back seat while he stood guard a moment longer. When it looked like the dogs were backing off, he joined us in the cab and shut the doors fast. He didn't talk for the first few minutes, just drove. Rachel and I sat in silence, breathing hard, still listening for the sound of paws or barking. Nothing came. Finally, Dave said, "I've been trying to trap that pack for months. They've been living out here since the last mining families moved out. Abandoned pets mostly. Smart as hell and meaner than anything wild." We didn't answer. He drove us all the way back to our car at the state park. Before we got out, he said, "Stick to marked trails from now on. I mean it. Those dogs, they've stopped being dogs a long time ago." We thanked him, then got in our car and left. A week later, we saw an article in a local paper. It said the pack had finally been captured with tranquilizers and transferred to a rehab facility in the county. A few were too far gone and had to be euthanized, but most were recovering. The story mentioned that they'd survived by scavenging and occasionally hunting. Sometimes at night, I still think about how they moved. Quiet, quick, always watching. And how fast pets can turn into predators when the world forgets about them. I was 34 when I got assigned to survey the fire damage along the eastern slopes of the Appalachian backcountry. I'd worked as a ranger for over a decade by then, and this was one of those routine trips we did after a wildfire. It was mid-September, a week after the blaze had been officially marked as contained. Most of the vegetation was still smoldered black, with patches of bare ground and ash underfoot. I packed the standard kit: GPS, paper maps, camera, extra batteries, basic med gear, and a trail axe in case I needed to clear a path. My boss told me to focus on the old logging roads first. The fire had jumped ridge lines and left a mess all across the area, so it made sense to follow the roads cleanup crews would hit next. I'd been up and down these trails since I was a teenager, and I wasn't worried about getting turned around. I had solid cell reception on most peaks, and the weather forecast was clean. 3 days of dry, sunny air. Perfect for a solo survey. I parked at the old ranger station trailhead around 6 a.m., locked the truck, and headed out on foot with 2 liters of water and enough food for 3 days. By noon on the first day, I'd logged 8 miles. The worst of the burn scars were along the southeast ridgeline. Deep char, trees split from the heat, and small rock slides where the roots had burned out. I stopped every few hundred yards to log coordinates, mark down damage levels, and snap reference photos. Some areas were worse than the satellite images had shown, especially around the old Mill Creek trail bend. A few deer tracks, 1 bear print, but otherwise nothing unusual. I made camp near a dry creek bed. The rocks still had soot on them, but the soil around it looked stable enough for a tarp and bag. I didn't hear anything that night except distant wind and a few snapping branches, typical for post-fire terrain. I slept okay. In the morning, I boiled water for instant coffee, checked my GPS, and planned out a loop east through the Pine Gap zone. That stretch hadn't been used much in years, but the map still had it marked as a Class C trail. I figured I'd hit the old logging switchbacks before swinging south by late afternoon. It was around 10:30 a.m. when I came across a series of buildings that weren't on any of my maps. The trail had narrowed and veered into a stand of pines that somehow hadn't burned. The trunks were dark from smoke but still standing. I saw rooftops through the trees, low structures like old cabins. I slowed down, thinking maybe I was near some private property line that had never been registered correctly. The first building I saw had a sign over the doorway, almost completely faded. I had to step close to make it out. It read, Pine Valley Youth Camp, painted in dull blue letters. No date, no official marker. The place looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago. Roofs were intact but sagging. Paint peeled off the sides of the buildings in strips. I tried checking the coordinates again. Nothing came up, just blank space on the overlay. No structures listed, no points of interest, no previous visits logged. That didn't make sense. Every structure over 10x10 feet was supposed to be registered if it was within park boundaries, and I'd never seen this place before, not even as a kid. I walked through the camp slowly, starting with the main building. The door was missing, leaning against a wall inside. Dust was thick on the floor. On one side of the room was a chalkboard with smudged writing, only a few words still legible. feeding time with Ranger Robbie, and below that, a list of names. I counted 8. At the bottom, someone had scrawled, "Still missing," in faded white chalk. There were 3 cabins nearby. Each had 2 rows of bunks and plywood floors, warped but not collapsed. The windows were open, some missing glass, and dead leaves had piled inside over the years. Tacked on the walls were old kids' drawings. Some were half torn, some still clinging with rusted thumbtacks. Crayon scribbles of animals, campfires, and smiling stick figures. One drawing had a man in a ranger hat surrounded by small kids, all holding hands. The words, "Ranger Robbie's Rules," were written along the top. I found a yellowing paper schedule pinned behind the door in one cabin. It listed daily activities from July to August: canoe time, crafts, fire safety, and bedtime at 8:30. The year printed in the corner was 1989. I took a few pictures, not sure if I needed to report this or not. Could have been a private church camp that got left off the updates. That happens sometimes with older properties, especially if the ownership gets murky. Still, something felt off. The fire had come close to this area, but the camp was untouched. No scorch marks on the ground. No fallen branches. It was like the flames had gone around it. I checked the perimeter for signs of recent use. Footprints, tire tracks, trash. Nothing. Just old pine needles, scattered debris, and silence. The place didn't smell like smoke either, which was strange considering the fire damage less than a mile away. In the back cabin, I opened a warped drawer under one of the bunks and found a pile of old paper wristbands, the kind camps used to give kids to show which group they were in. Most were moldy, unreadable, but one had a name, Derek K., written in black marker. Under it, the ink had bled into the paper. I tucked it into a plastic sample bag just in case. As I stepped out of that cabin, I noticed something new. A line of rocks forming a circle in the clearing beyond the trees. It didn't look like a natural deposit. Too even, too deliberate. I walked over to check it out. The stones were small, placed tightly in a ring about 10 feet across. In the center was an old metal grate, rusted and partially buried, like the base of a fire pit or grill setup. I nudged it with my boot, and it shifted slightly. Something shiny was underneath. I crouched down and brushed away some of the pine needles and dirt. There was a badge. A park ranger badge, dulled with age, face up in the soil. I picked it up and flipped it over. The name tag read, Robert H., but the rest was too corroded to make out. I stood up and scanned the tree line. Everything was still. Quiet. No wind. I pulled out my GPS again and checked the waypoint. Still blank. The system wasn't even logging my current location anymore. The signal bar had dropped to 0. I tapped it, cycled the power, waited. Nothing. I took a few more steps toward the tree line, then stopped. There were boot prints leading away from the clearing, heading into the woods. Fresh ones. My compass needle was still spinning when I tried heading back toward where I thought the trail had been. The dirt path I'd followed into the camp was gone. Not overgrown or washed out. Just gone. I circled twice, backtracking to where I remembered crossing a big scorched pine stump. But it wasn't there anymore. Everything looked the same now. Gray trees, blackened trunks, ash on the ground, silence pressing in from every side. Not even wind. No sound of birds or bugs. Just the soft crunch of my boots and the faint creaking from the lodge behind me. I headed back inside the main building, thinking maybe I could climb up and get a better view. The front room had warped floorboards and cracked walls, but the ceiling joists were solid. As I crossed the common area, I spotted something I hadn't noticed before. There, In the center of the room was a perfect circle made from plush toys. About 10 teddy bears, maybe more, arranged carefully in a ring. They looked out of place. Their fur was clean. No ash, no fading. Each one sat upright, paws in their laps, glassy eyes facing inward toward a wooden hatch set into the floor. I crouched by the hatch. The wood was heavy, fitted with an iron handle, and it looked newer than the rest of the building. Around the edge of the hatch, fresh scratches marred the floor, like it had been pried open recently. Some of the marks were deep. The bears hadn't been disturbed. They sat there in total stillness, like they'd been placed there for some reason. I hesitated. Every instinct in my gut said I shouldn't touch it. But I needed to know. I wrapped my hand in a glove and gripped the handle. It gave with a loud creak, the hinges groaning as I lifted the hatch and propped it open with a piece of timber from a broken chair. Cold, damp air rose from the dark below. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it into the hole. A narrow wooden ladder led down maybe 12 feet. I couldn't see the bottom clearly, but it looked like an old root cellar. Stone walls, dirt floor, some scattered crates. I took a cautious step onto the ladder and leaned forward. That's when I heard the sounds. Quiet at first. Shuffling. A slow, dragging noise. Then a short, sharp scrape, like nails across stone. I held the light steady, squinting. Movement. Something big shifted in the dark, half hidden behind a stack of crates. For a second, I caught a glimpse of a shape. Broad shoulders, thick legs. It looked like a bear, hunched and unmoving. But smaller shapes were gathered around it, almost human-sized, crouched low. I stepped back up the ladder, heart hammering. The beam of my light flickered, then steadied again. When I aimed it back down, the shapes were gone. All I saw now were some old training dummies, rubber mannequins used for safety drills, set up in weird positions. A metal stretcher leaned against the wall. Some faded life jackets were piled in the corner. I didn't even think. I dropped the hatch hard and nearly crushed my own fingers doing it. The noise echoed in the lodge, sharp and final. I didn't stop to look at the bears again. I grabbed my pack off the ground, shoved everything inside as fast as I could, and got out the door. I ran. Branches slapped my face, caught on my clothes. My boots slipped on ash and roots, but I didn't stop. I didn't look at the GPS. I didn't call for help. I just kept going. Deeper into the forest, away from the camp, from the hatch, from the silence. My legs didn't carry me far. Maybe a mile, maybe less. By the time I collapsed, it was dark. My canteen was empty. My hands were scraped raw. I stayed there on the ground, curled under a half-burned log, too afraid to close my eyes but too tired to keep them open. They found me the next morning. A search party had gone out when I failed to check in. A fire crew had seen my flagged trail markers but no movement. They swept the ridgeline and found me near the west slope, dehydrated, shaking, barely able to speak. I tried explaining what I'd seen, about the camp, the cellar, the bears, but my throat was raw and the words didn't make much sense. One of the medics kept asking me if I'd eaten any unfamiliar plants. Another asked if I had hit my head. Once I was rehydrated and calm enough, I insisted they follow me back. My supervisor agreed. He was an older guy who'd known the area for longer than me. He figured maybe I'd stumbled onto some old property line, maybe even a squatter camp. We went back together that afternoon. 5 rangers, including me. I retraced the path as best I could, using landmarks, my photos, everything I had. But when we got to the coordinates, there was nothing there. Just scorched earth, a patch of blackened forest, and a few downed trees. No cabins, no lodge, no teddy bears, no cellar. just ash and dead pine needles. I pulled out my camera to show them the pictures I'd taken. Every photo was either corrupted or completely black. My GPS had logged no coordinates after I entered the tree line that morning. The route data stopped cold just before the time I'd reached the camp. The next day, my supervisor pulled old records. He found a file on Pine Valley Youth Camp. It had operated for 2 seasons, 1987 and 1988. There'd been a bear attack during a group hike. A counselor and 2 kids were killed. The parents sued. The whole thing was kept quiet to avoid press coverage. The site was condemned and supposedly bulldozed in 1990. No trace left. Nothing should have remained up there. A week later, I got a manila envelope delivered to my office. No return address. Inside was a single photo, aged, water-stained. It showed a tall man in a ranger uniform kneeling beside a group of children, all smiling at the camera. The name on his tag was clear: R. Martinez. The date on the back read August 12th, 1989. They say the mountains forget, but some places don't. So when I was 18, I got hired by Cumberland Logging Company for summer work in the Kentucky hills. The pay was decent for someone fresh out of high school, and I needed the cash bad for college. They had a big contract to clear out timber along a proposed access road deep in the Appalachian backcountry. There weren't any real towns nearby, just a company site trailer and a few miles of rugged gravel. We'd meet there early, around 5:30, and be cutting trees by first light. Long days, loud machines, chainsaws whining, the usual. At the end of the shift, we'd load up into the trucks and head back to the motel we were staying at an hour down the mountain. Midway through the first week, our foreman asked if anyone wanted to work nights. They were falling behind on schedule and needed to pick up the pace. Night shifts paid time and a half, and I didn't even hesitate. I said I'd do it right away. Some of the older guys laughed and told me I'd regret it, but I figured I'd just wear a headlamp and keep cutting. My parents thought I was insane when I told them on the phone, especially after hearing it meant being alone out in the woods, but I brushed it off. It was just timber work. I figured I'd do it, stack my money, and be out in 3 months. The terrain was thick, tight ridge lines, deep hollows, and no cell service whatsoever. You'd lose the signal 15 minutes up the logging road. We had radios, but they barely worked beyond the hilltop. On day shifts, we worked in groups of 3 or 4, moving equipment along the path where the road was going to be. Nights would be solo. You'd get assigned a sector, take a generator, your saw, and some extra gas, and start felling marked trees. The company had spray-painted bright orange X's on them during the survey phase. Just follow the map and the markings. The first few days I stuck to daytime hours. It was fine. Hot, humid, physically tough, but I got used to the rhythm. The only thing that bugged me was this weird feeling, like someone was nearby, watching. At first, I thought it was nothing. I'd look over my shoulder after noticing something move out the corner of my eye, and there'd just be tree trunks and low brush. Dense woods can mess with your vision. But it kept happening. A shadow darting between trees. Something just barely out of sight. It always vanished when I turned my head. Then, some of the gear started getting moved. I remember one morning showing up to find the chainsaws lying on the opposite side of the clearing from where we'd left them. I was sure I'd put the fuel cans beside the stump near the ATV, but they were 10 feet away under a tarp. I asked the others if they'd done anything. One guy said maybe bears. Another said probably the other shift messing around. Still, it didn't sit right. One lunch break, the crew boss told us to take 15. I sat on a cooler, unwrapping my sandwich, when I noticed two of the older guys off to the side, whispering. One of them looked over his shoulder twice. Later, I asked what was up. He said, "Sometimes you hear talking out there, voices that don't belong to anybody." He tried to laugh it off, but I noticed he hadn't brought it up until we were sitting close to the trucks. I figured they were just messing with the new guy. But even after dismissing it, things kept piling up. Another morning, we came back and found a ladder bent backward like someone had stood on it and then kicked it over. No one admitted it. I checked with the night crew. They hadn't used that spot. The foreman started locking up the gas cans in his truck bed at night just in case. I wasn't sure if it was paranoia or some local kids sneaking up from somewhere nearby. But that didn't add up either. We were in the middle of nowhere. The fifth day, it rained heavy all morning. By afternoon, it dried out enough for some of us to go out and assess the slopes for safety. I was helping one of the guys load the trailer when he pointed to the tree line and asked, "You see that?" I looked, but whatever he'd spotted was already gone. I asked what he saw, and he just shook his head. Said maybe a deer. But he was packing up faster after that. Later that evening, back at the motel, I overheard another crew member saying his gas can was half empty when he came back to it, even though it had been sealed. That same night, someone brought up that tools had gone missing over the last couple of shifts. The company assumed it was misplacement, but we were a tight crew, and the same few guys always loaded and unloaded. We didn't forget things like that. Still, there were no answers. Around that time, I started prepping for my first night shift. My first solo night shift started at 8 p.m. It was already dark, and I had only the hum of a generator and a couple of floodlights to keep the place from turning pitch black. I set up on a small ridge about a mile from the main road. The company map had orange markings all over that zone, so I knew I'd be out there a few hours. There wasn't a breeze, no animal noises, nothing. Just the echo of my own footsteps and the metallic click of tools. By around 10, I was mid-cut through a thick trunk when I caught something odd through my earmuffs. Voices. I shut the chainsaw off and pulled the muffs down. The sound was faint, but clear enough to know it wasn't animals. People were out there, not far past the tree line. It sounded like two men arguing, their voices low but tense. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm of back and forth shouting. I scanned the dark, but saw nothing past the glow of the floodlights. Then silence. I started the saw again. A few minutes later, the voices started up. I killed the saw. Silence. This back and forth went on for maybe an hour. The sound came and went with the chainsaw, like they were watching me and didn't want to be heard. I kept telling myself it was probably hikers or someone camping nearby. But who camps in total darkness with no fire, no lights, and doesn't answer when you call out? Then I noticed the footprints. Around the edge of the clearing where I'd parked the fuel cans, there were impressions in the mud. Wide, heavy prints not matching any of our crew boots. We all wore steel toes, and these had a different pattern. Fresh, too. Some were right behind my generator, maybe 10 or 15 feet from where I'd just been. They hadn't been there when I unloaded the truck. I crouched to look closer, and saw that the dirt was still moist around the edges. Whoever made those had been there no more than half an hour earlier. I thought about calling it in, but my radio barely worked, and the truck was parked on a slope with no signal. I could leave, head back, and try to explain to the foreman why I bailed mid-shift. Or I could finish the night and earn another $100. I hated how long I stood there weighing it. I turned the chainsaw back on. It was just past midnight when I saw them. 3 men stepped out of the tree line at the edge of the light, about 50 yards downhill. No warning, no sound. Just appeared between 2 thick oaks. They weren't wearing work gear or reflective vests. All 3 had rifles slung in front, their bodies half in shadow, but close enough for me to see that they weren't lost hikers. They didn't speak. Just stood there staring. I kept one hand on the saw and slowly stepped back toward the generator. Then one of them broke off and started walking toward me. Not rushing, just steady, like he knew I wasn't going to run. His rifle was in his hands, not aimed yet, but ready. That was enough for me. I yanked the cord on the generator, cutting all power instantly. The floodlights went dark. I had my headlamp on, a narrow beam in a sea of black trees. I dropped the chainsaw and ran full tilt toward the logging truck. My boots slipped on the wet dirt, and I almost went down near a felled trunk, but I caught myself and pushed on. I could hear shouting behind me as I reached the truck door. One voice, rough, yelling something like, "Stay out of our woods," or, "You don't belong here." I slammed the door shut and fired the engine. The tires struggled for traction in the mud, but I got it moving. I didn't even try to back up the slope properly. I turned the wheel and forced the truck into the ditch, scraping the bumper on rocks, anything to get away from those guys. I drove downhill like a maniac, bouncing over every rut in the old service path. Didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, covered in sweat, hands shaking. At the sheriff's station, the deputy on duty looked at me like I was making it up. Said no one had reported squatters or trespassers in those woods. He took down the basics, asked if I'd been drinking, and said they'd look into it. I left thinking it was all going to get brushed off. Next morning, everything changed. By noon, half a dozen county vehicles and 2 federal trucks were up at the site. The company shut down the whole operation for the day. A search crew followed the trails around the ridgeline where I'd seen the men. By late afternoon, they found it. A full-blown marijuana grow-up, hidden in the deep folds of the valley past our work site. Rows of plants under camo tarps, irrigation lines tapped into natural springs, portable generators, barrels of fertilizer. They found drying racks, packaged product, even a table with scales and zip bags. 6 people got arrested before the end of the week, and cops said a few others likely got away into the woods. Turned out they'd been using that spot for years. Perfect cover. Hard to reach, no roads, no rangers. Our logging job pushed into their hidden pocket, and they saw me as a threat. I had no idea how close I came to disappearing. My supervisor pulled me aside 2 days later, said the company was cutting its losses and moving the crew to another site. He thanked me for what I'd done, though I didn't feel like I'd done anything brave. I just didn't die. I never went back into those woods again. I took the rest of the summer off logging and found a job at a grocery store until college started. Sometimes I still think about those boot prints behind the generator. How long they must have been watching. What would have happened if I hadn't run when I did? Those hills looked peaceful in daylight, but they weren't empty. Not even close. It happened 3 years back when I was 29, doing my postdoc in geology. The University of Arizona had approved a field project for me, something I'd worked toward for months, studying a rare cave system in the Appalachian Range. The place was known among a few locals for its untouched mineral layers, and for my research on subsurface water channels, it was perfect. My advisor, Dr. Miller, came along to oversee the scientific documentation. 2 caving professionals joined us too. David, a sharp guy from UNC, and Marcus, a quieter type from Georgia Tech. We'd been working on this for 8 months straight, from permit paperwork to gear lists to local emergency contacts. Everything had to be accounted for. The place wasn't mapped properly, which meant risks, but also clean data. We chose a spot 2 miles from the cave opening to set up our tents, using one for sleeping, one for gear, and another for maps and food storage. Power came from a portable generator and solar chargers for backup. We entered the main passage on the first day just to get a feel. Tight in some places, smooth and wide in others, it was cold and still. The kind of silence that makes your own breathing feel too loud. David took point while Marcus handled gear inventory. I stuck close to Dr. Miller with the notes. We used laser rangefinders, water sensors, and high-res cameras. Every 100 feet, we marked positions with reflective tape and GPS coordinates where possible. On day 3, we found a vertical shaft with a steady water drip and promising wall deposits, shiny greenish-black veins I hadn't seen in any samples before. We logged it and planned a more thorough scan later that week. By the morning of day 4, we were already syncing well as a team. Everyone had a job, and no one complained. We kept underground shifts to 6 hours max, then rotated back to base for rest. That morning, while we were reviewing the previous day's footage, David noticed something in one of the deeper corridor clips, an opening that hadn't shown on the previous map scans. It was off to the left of a narrowing curve, half hidden behind a fallen chunk of limestone. He got excited. "Might be a sidearm," he said, leaning toward Dr. Miller. "Could be where the mineral run starts." Dr. Miller gave a short nod. "All right, take a recon kit, 1 hour in, 1 hour out. Report at every mark." David packed fast. Standard rig, headlamp, radio, mineral vials, and some backup lights. Marcus helped him double-check the harness buckles and battery levels. He disappeared into the passage by 10:40 a.m. sharp. I logged the time. We expected his first radio call by 11:40. Right on time, we heard his voice through the handheld unit. "Reached a drop-off but manageable. Interesting flow lines here. Crystals forming along the top ridge." Dr. Miller gave the usual reply. "Noted. Maintain contact. Next call at 01340. But that second call didn't come. 15 minutes passed, then 30. We tried hailing him. Nothing. Just static. We moved closer to the point where the side tunnel branched off, trying to boost signal range, but it didn't help. We waited. 1 hour became 2. Marcus kept checking the equipment, swapping antennas, changing frequencies. No response. Dr. Miller didn't speak much, but his hands kept tightening and loosening around the radio. By hour 3, we were discussing options. Protocol said to wait 4 hours unless we heard distress. David hadn't called for help. Still, the silence didn't sit right. At exactly 2:37 p.m., the radio flared up with loud, jagged static. Then David's voice cut through, clipped and a little off. "Still here. Took longer. Documenting samples. Need more time." His tone wasn't rushed or panicked. No background noise, just dry words. Dr. Miller asked for coordinates. David didn't respond. Just a pause, and then he added, "Don't come in yet. Narrow space. I'll be back by late afternoon." We stood around for a minute. Dr. Miller pressed the talk button again. "Repeat coordinates. Do you need assistance?" No reply. Nothing else came through after that. Just the low hiss of the open line. Dr. Miller set the radio down slowly. Marcus looked at me, and then walked over to check the time logs. We still had daylight above ground, but it was getting late in cave hours. David was now 5 hours into what should have been a 2-hour task. No sign of distress, but no details either. We stayed near the entrance of the side passage, listening. David showed up again just after 4:30 p.m., almost 6.5 hours after he'd gone in. We were still near the side tunnel, packing up our gear to head back to camp. He came out slow, walking stiff, soaked in sweat, and his face had a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. His eyes were bloodshot, but he was grinning. Not the usual calm, satisfied smile he gave after a good discovery. This was different, tighter. almost forced. "I found something," he said, voice low but urgent. "I think it's big. Like, really big. This could change everything about what we know." Dr. Miller asked for specifics, but David just shook his head and said, "I need to process the footage first. The minerals are unlike anything we've cataloged. You'll see." He held up his camera, then stuffed it into his pack before anyone could look. He didn't offer to show us anything, not even a sample. Back at camp, he avoided our questions. Every time Dr. Miller tried to ask about the depth, the layout, or even the chemical makeup of what he'd found, David gave a vague answer or changed the topic. "It's more complex than it sounds," he said. "I need more time to frame it correctly. It's not something you just explain." During dinner, he barely touched his food, just picked at it, and kept looking over his shoulder toward the cave. When the wind picked up and made the tarp flap, he jerked so hard his cup spilled. Marcus asked him if he was okay, but David didn't respond. He just stared past us for a second, then got up and sat by himself outside the tent circle. Later that night, Marcus and I talked quietly while doing gear checks. "He's not right," Marcus said. "He's hiding something. I don't like this." I nodded but didn't know what to say. David wasn't acting like himself. He was sharp, organized, always took notes. But now he wouldn't even log the new coordinates. He just said, "I'll remember." Around 2 a.m., I was woken by a shout. Loud, sharp, panicked. "Marcus." I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent in time to hear a heavy thud, followed by another yell. I rushed toward Marcus's tent and found David crouched inside, holding a rock the size of a cantaloupe. Blood was splattered across the tent walls, and Marcus lay slumped on his side, bleeding badly from his head. "David!" I yelled. He turned to me, eyes wide, face pale, breathing heavy. "I had to," he said. "He was going to take it. I made promises. They told me it has to stay hidden." I didn't wait. I dove at him and grabbed the hand holding the rock. We crashed backward into the dirt. He was stronger than I expected, way stronger. He fought back like an animal, kicking and twisting, trying to get the rock up again. I managed to elbow him hard in the ribs, which stunned him for a second, just enough time for Dr. Miller to arrive and help pin him down. We tied him up with the extra rope we kept near the supply tent. He struggled the entire time, shouting nonsense about sacred walls and whispers and the keepers underground. His voice cracked, and sometimes he'd switch from shouting to whispering like he was talking to someone else entirely. Meanwhile, I knelt next to Marcus and checked his pulse. He was alive, but barely. Blood ran down his face, soaking into his sleeping bag. He blinked once, slow, but didn't speak. I patched him up as best as I could with the med kit, wrapping gauze tight around his head and trying to keep him stable. As soon as we had David secured and Marcus stabilized, Dr. Miller radioed for emergency evac. It took just under 4 hours for the helicopter to arrive. During that time, David calmed down. Too calm. He sat still, not speaking, staring at the cave entrance. He didn't blink much, didn't sleep, just waited. We thought we had him under control, but as the helicopter team started prepping Marcus for airlift, someone shouted. David had slipped free. The ropes lay empty, frayed. We found one of the utility knives from the cook kit missing. The last anyone saw of him, he was sprinting toward the cave mouth, not even looking back. The rescue team organized a full search. For 5 days, they combed every tunnel we had mapped, and many we hadn't. They brought in pros from out of state, experts in tight space recovery. Nothing. No body, no gear, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like he vanished. Marcus survived the flight to the hospital, but the damage was serious. He spent weeks in intensive care, then months in rehab. When he finally woke up fully, he didn't remember the cave, not the expedition, not David, not me. Just blank spots. The doctors said the trauma likely wiped out short-term memory around the event. The cave system was sealed off by the authorities 2 weeks later. Park services declared it too dangerous for civilian access. They cited unstable rock and uncharted drop-offs, but we knew the real reason. No one wanted another missing person tied to that site. David was never found. No trace, no sightings, nothing. I still work in geology, but I don't do field work anymore. Every few months I get an itch to recheck the old data. Look through the photos from that trip, but I never find anything new. Just the same unanswered question. What did David really see down there? And was it ever meant to be found? When I was 26, I worked as an aquatic biologist for the State Environmental Agency. Most of our work involved collecting water samples and measuring water quality in remote streams, especially in areas being considered for mining permits. That summer, my research partner Tyler and I had been sent to a patch of Appalachian backcountry to conduct a week-long survey of headwater ecosystems. It was my third season doing this kind of fieldwork, but Tyler was new. He'd just finished his master's degree and was eager to get everything right. I liked him well enough. He asked a lot of questions and took notes on everything I did, which was fine. Better that than having to chase someone down a mountain because they forgot to mark coordinates. We'd hiked in 3 days earlier, starting from a gravel parking lot that was mostly potholes and pine needles. Since then, we hadn't seen another soul. Just trees, creeks, and silence. The work was pretty routine. Take pH readings, test dissolved oxygen levels, document fish populations, and log everything into waterproof notebooks. At night, we camped in a small clearing by the river, cooked instant meals over a canister stove, and compared notes by headlamp light. The place was remote. No signal, no roads, not even old cabins or hunting blinds. Just untouched woods. It was the kind of silence you only really notice when you stop walking. On the fourth morning, we packed up our gear early and headed downstream to check out a few more small tributaries before circling back toward our starting point. Around mid-afternoon, we came across a narrow stream that, at first glance, looked ideal. Clear water, decent flow rate, shaded banks, basically textbook conditions for headwater species. But as soon as I knelt to scoop a sample, I felt something was off. The water was cold and clean looking, but completely lifeless. I mean nothing. No insects under the rocks, no minnows darting away from our boots, not even algae on the stones. That's not just uncommon. That's impossible in a place like this. We split up to cover more ground. I stayed to collect a full suite of samples. pH, nitrate levels, total dissolved solids. Tyler moved upstream, saying he wanted to see if the stream had any feeders or obstructions. The banks were oddly dry for this time of year and scattered with dead wildlife, small stuff like birds and squirrels. No signs of injury, no blood, no bloating or smell like you'd expect from decay. They looked like they'd just stopped moving. Half an hour later, Tyler called out from farther up. His voice was tight, clipped. I followed the sound and found him standing beside a low concrete dam about half a mile upstream. It was old but intact, spanning maybe 20 feet across. Water trickled over the top in a shallow sheet. On the far side, built into the slope, was a rusted hatch set into the ground. It had heavy bolts and markings I didn't recognize. Faded yellow paint, stenciled letters, a few old survey symbols from the Department of the Interior. the kind you don't see on public maps. "This isn't on any of our coordinates," Tyler said, not looking away from the hatch. I walked closer. The hatch looked like something you'd find at an old missile site. It had warning signs, but most of the words were unreadable. Just symbols: corrosion, hazard, no entry. A pipe extended from beneath the dam wall and emptied into the creek. It was coated in residue, a pale gray sludge that stained the moss around it. I dipped a sample bottle into the outflow and capped it tight. There was no noise except for the soft trickle of water and the occasional hiss of wind through the trees. No birdsong, no insects. Tyler kept staring at the hatch like he was trying to read through the rust. I didn't want to touch it. The air around it felt still in a way I didn't like. "We should report this as a potential spill site," I said, already marking the GPS. "We're not equipped to test industrial waste." Tyler nodded slowly, but didn't move. "We need to head back before dark," I added. "Grab your bag." He finally looked at me, blinked once, then turned and started walking downstream without a word. I followed, keeping a steady pace behind him, making sure he wasn't about to wander off. He didn't say anything the whole way back, just kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone, or something, to be following us. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already low. We set up the tent in silence. He boiled water for food, but didn't eat. Just sat with the cup in his hands, staring into the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hatch, about the way the animals looked, like their bodies had just shut down. I told myself it was probably runoff from old mining operations. Maybe something deep underground had leached into the water table. That made more sense than anything else. At dawn, Tyler was already awake, crouched by the stream with his sample kit open but untouched. When I asked if he was all right, he just shook his head. "I think we should go back to the car today," he said. "Without finishing the transect?" I asked. He didn't answer. I didn't argue. We broke camp quickly, packed our gear, and started the long hike back toward the trailhead. We stayed off the stream beds and kept to higher ground. Tyler kept pausing, turning around like he was listening for something. I didn't hear anything, but I didn't like the silence either. About 3 miles in, he stopped walking. I looked back and saw him standing perfectly still on the trail, eyes fixed on a bend in the path behind us. "There was someone up there," he said. That night we camped further from the contaminated stream, just off a ridgeline with a better view of the valley below. Around midnight, I woke up to a low vibration running through the ground, almost too faint to notice at first. Then came the noise, deep, mechanical humming, steady and slow like turbines or underground conveyors. It didn't sound natural, and it didn't match anything you'd expect to hear in the middle of a national forest. No wind, no animal sounds, just that industrial hum rolling up from the ground. It lasted until just before dawn, then stopped all at once, like a switch had been thrown. Tyler hadn't slept either. He sat outside the tent with his boots on, eyes locked on the tree line. The next day, he was a different person. He didn't talk much during breakfast, but as soon as we packed up, he said we had to go back to the hatch. "Something's still running down there," he said. "That's not just runoff, it's active. Someone left that whole system on." I told him it wasn't our job to investigate beyond collecting samples and reporting the site. We didn't have protective gear, didn't know what kind of chemicals we were dealing with, and we had no clue how old that infrastructure was. It could collapse. He didn't care. He was sure this was bigger than anything the agency had seen in years. Illegal industrial operations buried in state land, still functioning somehow. "We can document it," he said. "Get photos, lay out details, maybe even trace the discharge. It's a huge discovery." He was already pulling maps and marking the spot where we'd found the hatch. Later that morning, while heading toward the trailhead to recharge radio batteries at a ranger post marked on our topographic map, we stumbled across what looked like a long abandoned supply depot. The shack had caved-in walls and moss covering most of the siding, but inside were a few broken chairs, shelves, and an old gear locker. Tyler found bolt cutters buried under a tarp. I didn't like the look in his eyes when he held them up. "I'm going back tomorrow," he said. "You don't have to come down, but I'm opening that hatch." I tried reasoning with him again, told him exposure could be fatal, and we didn't even know how deep the structure went. He wasn't listening anymore. He spent the rest of the evening cleaning the bolt cutters, checking his headlamp batteries, and repacking his gear. I stayed quiet. Around noon the next day, Tyler cut the bolts and opened the hatch. The air that came out was stale and chemical, like rust mixed with solvent. He tied a rope around his waist for safety and carried a handheld radio. I kept the second unit topside, pacing near the hatch and watching the minutes crawl by. He said he'd be back in 30 minutes. 30 minutes turned into an hour, then 2. I tried the radio every 5 minutes. Nothing. Static. I started building a signal fire. Just as I was about to climb the hill to get a better transmission line, the radio crackled. "I'm here," Tyler's voice came through. "I'm fine. It's huge down here." His voice sounded weak. He said he'd found rusted stairs, catwalks, large tanks lined up along concrete corridors, some with yellow hazard symbols painted on the side. He kept mentioning pumps, fans, and water tanks the size of trucks. He said it looked like mining runoff was being stored and moved automatically, all of it still powered. No lights, but machinery still humming somewhere deeper inside. Another 2 hours passed before I saw his headlamp bobbing in the hatch. He needed help climbing out. His legs shook, and he dropped to his knees after clearing the entrance. His face was drenched in sweat, and his skin had taken on a pale gray color. He vomited twice before saying anything. "Hurts everywhere," he muttered, heads pounding. He couldn't stand for more than a few seconds. His hands trembled. I opened his backpack and saw his notebook soaked with condensation, his gloves stained with oily residue. I recognized the symptoms: tremors, nausea, metallic breath, burning skin. It was textbook heavy metal exposure. Maybe mercury, maybe worse. We didn't have time to argue. I packed up everything we could carry, dragged him to the car, and drove 3 hours without stopping. He passed out twice on the ride, and I kept checking his breathing. When we got to the nearest hospital, I told them about the possible contamination. They rushed him inside while I sat in the waiting area, still covered in dirt and ash from the hatch. Blood tests confirmed exposure to high levels of mercury, lead, arsenic, and cadmium. His kidneys were failing, and they started chelation treatment immediately. He spent 2 weeks in the ICU. When he finally stabilized, he couldn't hold a pen straight. His speech was slurred. The neurologist told us some of the damage was permanent. He'd never return to field work. After filing our incident reports and logging the GPS data, we returned with a team from the State Environmental Authority. But heavy rains the week before had done their work. The hatch site was under 4 feet of muddy runoff. The dam was still there, but the pipe was broken, its discharge buried in silt. The structure Tyler entered was flooded and sealed with debris. The geological record said the site had been used for deep core sampling in the 1970s by a private company that no longer existed. The paperwork said all operations ceased in 1981, with full decommissioning of equipment. But what Tyler saw down there, running pumps, waste tanks, that constant humming, none of that matched what the record said. We submitted our findings. The agency logged it as a contaminated site pending further review. Nothing ever came of it. The soil tests showed elevated levels, but without access to the underground facility, there was no way to confirm ongoing activity. Tyler's career was over, and my report was buried under routine paperwork. No follow-up, no investigation. We still talk sometimes. He has trouble with short-term memory, can't hike anymore. He keeps saying we found something we were never supposed to find. I believe him. Out there, in the silent parts of those mountains, there are places the land was never allowed to heal. Places where old machines keep running because no one ever came back to turn them off. When I was 19, I decided to do my biology project on native Tennessee flora. I picked a remote section of the Appalachian Trail to do it. My friends thought I was out of my mind for going alone, but I had done tons of solo day hikes before, and I liked the quiet. I packed light but smart: tent, notebook, sample bags, camera, 3 days worth of food, water filter, GPS, and my campus ID. I made sure to text my roommate my full plan and the location of the trailhead before I left. I even gave him a date and time I'd be back, plus a call for help cutoff if I didn't return. I got to the trailhead early Tuesday morning. There were a few other hikers in the parking lot, but nothing crowded. It was a cool, clear day. I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots and the smell of pine when I stepped off the lot and into the trees. The first few miles were easy. I passed a couple of older backpackers heading out, and we exchanged short greetings. I kept moving at a steady pace, snapping photos and jotting quick notes whenever I saw a species I didn't recognize. About 7 miles in, I turned off onto a smaller side trail that led downhill into a wide, quiet valley. My map showed it as a dead-end hollow with a small stream running through it. It was perfect for what I needed: isolated, moist ground, and shady forest cover. I reached a small clearing right near the water, surrounded on all sides by thick trees and mossy rocks. It was late afternoon by then. I pitched my tent near a big downed log, filtered some water, and made a simple dinner. I remember hearing nothing but birds and insects. It felt safe, still. The next day, I got up early and started exploring the area. I moved in slow circles from my camp, photographing mosses, leaves, seed pods. Around noon, I took a break on a flat rock by the stream. I remember the sun through the canopy and a red dragonfly landing on my boot. Nothing about it felt strange. After lunch, I pushed deeper into the trees northeast of the camp. That's when I found some rare ferns along a ridge, half covered in leaf litter. I crouched down, brushed the dirt off gently, and started taking pictures. I was mid-photo when I heard movement, like someone stepping on dry twigs behind me. I stood up quick, half expecting a deer or maybe another hiker. There was a man standing just beyond the trees, maybe 30 feet back. I hadn't heard him approach. He was probably mid-40s, wearing tan hiking pants, a dark jacket, and a big blue pack. His boots looked new. His beard was patchy, not quite full. He smiled when he saw me and raised one hand in a casual wave. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Didn't think anyone else would be out here this far." I nodded but didn't say much. He stepped closer, slowly, like trying not to spook me. "You a botanist or something?" "Student," I said. "College project." He looked around, then at the ferns. "Good spot. Not many people know this hollow exists. I grew up around here. Hiked it 100 times." I gave a tight smile and went back to my camera, hoping he'd keep walking. "You camping out here?" he asked. I kept my voice even. "Meeting up with people later. Just finishing up." He nodded slowly, like weighing that. "You're smart to bring friends. A lot of folks get lost around here. He paused. Saw some bear tracks this morning, not far from here. I didn't answer that. He stepped past me, bent to look at a plant, then stood again. I know a spot with some rare pitcher plants, if you want to see something special. I shook my head. Thanks, but I've got enough for the report. Gotta wrap it up today. He didn't leave right away. Just stood there a bit longer, looking around too calmly. Then he gave another quick smile, turned, and started walking back toward the trail. I waited until I couldn't hear his steps before moving again. I circled back toward camp but took a longer route, changing direction twice. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. Nothing but the forest. But I kept thinking about how quiet he had been when he showed up, how he never asked for my name, and how new his boots looked. I didn't see him again that day. That evening, I was crouched by the fire pit boiling water for my freeze-dried dinner when I heard footsteps again. He came from the same direction as earlier, stepping out between two trees like he'd just wandered over casually. I stood up fast, trying to keep my body between him and my tent. He smiled wider than before, like we were old friends now. "Hey," he said. "Been thinking about what you said earlier, about your project. I really want to help. There's this meadow not too far from here, like 2 miles tops, off trail. Got stuff you've probably never seen." He walked closer as he talked, setting down his pack near the log I'd used as a seat. I didn't sit back down. The sky was already dimming. I shook my head. "It's almost dark," I said. "I don't do night hikes." "You wouldn't need a light," he said. "I know the way blindfolded." I stayed quiet. He looked at the fire for a moment, then back at me. "Look, you want to do real field work or not?" he said, more forcefully. "This is the kind of opportunity you don't pass up. You came all the way out here, and now you're saying no?" I crossed my arms. "Maybe tomorrow morning." His face tightened, just for a second, like he didn't like that answer. Then he smiled again. "You sure anyone knows you're out here?" he asked. "I mean, the exact spot? What if you got hurt?" He said it like a joke, but there was nothing funny in his voice. I stepped back and said I had to pee, grabbed my phone from my tent, and ducked behind a tree. No signal. I stood still, breathing slow, trying to listen. No movement. When I came back, he was still by the fire, poking at it with a stick. "You drive a Subaru, right?" he asked without looking at me. "Saw one parked at the trailhead. Figured it was yours." I didn't answer. "That's a long way down from here." "You sure you locked it?" Then he started asking about my tent, if it was waterproof, what kind of brand it was, and whether I brought bear spray. I gave short answers, my eyes flicking to the trail, the trees, his hands. "You've got nice gear," he said. "Pretty high-end for a student." I said I was tired and needed to sleep. He stood up, brushing off his pants. "Well, I'll stay nearby. Make sure you're safe tonight." I didn't respond. I crawled into the tent and zipped it up, hands unsteady, trying to keep my breath quiet. I listened as he paced around outside, first near the fire, then circling my tent slowly. Leaves and twigs crunched under his boots. At one point, I heard something drag along the outside wall of my tent. Maybe a stick, maybe his hand. The fire popped once, then it was just his movements. For over an hour, he didn't leave. It was close to midnight when I heard his steps again, this time right up against the tent. He walked around it in a full circle. Then I heard a soft metallic sound. The zipper. He was touching it gently, like testing how loud it would be. I held my breath and didn't move. I waited, heart pounding, counting his steps. He stopped moving. Eventually it went quiet. long quiet. I stayed still for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, I slid my sleeping bag open and grabbed my headlamp and phone. I didn't turn either on. I reached for my pack, keeping only what I needed: my ID, GPS, water, and a protein bar. I left the rest. I unzipped the back of the tent inch by inch. I slipped out and crouched low behind the tent, listening. No movement, no sound. I stepped into the woods, keeping the fire behind me. I didn't use my light until I was 100 feet away. Then I moved fast. The trail was hard to follow in the dark. I used my phone flashlight, turning it on only for a few seconds at a time, just enough to keep from falling. I stayed off the main path, moving along ridges and low brush to stay hidden. I didn't know if he was following. I didn't look back. I walked for 6 straight hours. My legs ached and my feet were sore, but I didn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting to the main trail. I reached it just after sunrise. A group of hikers with day packs was coming from the other direction. 2 men and a woman. I waved, breathless, and they stopped. I told them everything: where I'd camped, what the man looked like, what he'd done. One of them gave me water, the other called the ranger station with their satellite phone. They stayed with me until the rangers arrived. The rangers were serious. When I gave the man's description, they exchanged looks. One of them said, "We've had reports." Turned out, they'd been searching for someone like him. He'd approached multiple solo female hikers on remote sections of the trail over the last month. Nothing violent had been confirmed, but one woman's gear had been found slashed. Another had abandoned her trip early after an encounter she wouldn't fully describe. 2 weeks later, they caught him. Another hiker spotted him hanging around a different trailhead, trying to start a conversation with a woman traveling alone. This time, someone called it in fast enough. Rangers found gear in his vehicle linked to several missing person cases going back 3 years. They never said more. I never went hiking alone again. Even now, years later, I tell people every detail of where I'm going and when I'll be back. Some people think it's overkill. It's not. Last July, me and 3 friends from college, Tyler, Brandon, and Jake, finally made the backpacking trip we'd been talking about since freshman year. We were all 22 and had just wrapped up our final exams, jobs lined up but not started yet. It felt like now or never. We picked the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee and mapped out a 7-day route. Each of us bought or borrowed good gear, stocked up on trail meals, and met up in Knoxville the night before we started. The next morning, we drove to the Cataract Falls trailhead and started hiking just after sunrise. The weather was clear, dry, and not too hot, which we took as a good sign. The trail was mostly quiet that Monday morning. No big groups, just a couple of older hikers we passed early on. The trees were thick and green. The air smelled sharp and clean. We were all in a good mood, cracking jokes and enjoying the views. We planned to hit several marked backcountry sites and tried to keep our schedule flexible in case of bad weather or someone getting tired. But for the first 2 days, everything was smooth. We set up camp early in the evenings, had enough energy for small hikes near camp, and were sleeping better than any of us expected. Tyler brought a water filter that worked way better than the iodine tablets we'd used on past trips. Brandon had packed 2 decks of cards, and we ended up playing poker with sticks and small rocks as betting chips. On the second night, a fox came near the camp while we were cooking, but it took off fast. No bears, no storms, no twisted ankles. Just clear skies and hard hikes. By the morning of day 3, we were getting deeper into the backcountry. Less foot traffic, no signs of people. Around midday, we reached a ridge with an incredible view of the valley below, then started descending toward a lake Tyler had picked out from the topo map. It wasn't marked as an official campsite, but we knew people had camped there before. It took a while to get down to it. Steep slope, some loose rocks, but the lake was worth it. Crystal clear water surrounded by thick evergreens and big rock slabs that caught the afternoon sun. No one else was around. No sounds but birds and wind. We picked a flat spot near the tree line to pitch tents. Jake started unpacking the jet boil to make lunch while Brandon set up the bear hang. I grabbed my towel and walked to the lake edge to soak my feet. The water was freezing but felt amazing. We all ate and then took about an hour to just lie in the sun. Around 4 p.m. we decided to explore the area around the lake before cooking dinner. Jake had a drone, but he left it at camp to keep things quiet. Tyler, as usual, was the one moving ahead, climbing up rocks and poking into odd corners. He had a weird habit of spotting things no one else noticed. Old bottles, bits of metal, feathers arranged in strange ways. About 20 minutes into the hike around the lake, Tyler shouted, "Guys, check this out!" We climbed up to where he was, a wide rock ledge about 10 feet above the trail. On top of the flat rock sat an animal skull, completely clean and white, not buried or hidden. It looked like a deer, based on the shape and size, though the antlers were gone. It was placed dead center on the rock, like someone had put it there on purpose. No signs of blood, no bugs, no fur. Just the skull. Jake laughed and said it looked like something from a horror movie. Tyler picked it up for a second, then set it back. "Creepy, right?" he said. We all took pictures. Brandon mentioned it was probably just some hunter's leftover, or maybe someone into bones or nature art. It wasn't uncommon, we figured. We stood there for a bit, not really sure what to say. Then we started making our way back to camp. I kept looking behind me more than usual, and I noticed Brandon doing the same. Not that we were scared, just weirded out. When we reached camp, the wind had picked up a little. Nothing serious, but enough to make the trees creak. Jake got the jet boil going again while I went to gather more wood. Tyler was already talking about the next day's trail. We had about 2 hours of daylight left. I dropped the sticks I'd gathered in the fire ring and went to check my pack. Something about the skull still bothered me. Not in a paranoid way, just a feeling that someone had been there not long before us. A skull that clean doesn't just show up out of nowhere, and the way it was placed didn't feel natural. Jake was sitting on a log, poking at the burner with a stick when he looked up. "Hey," he said. "Did any of you move my phone?" We all shook our heads. He patted his pockets, checked the tent, then his backpack. "I left it right here," he said, pointing to a small rock next to the fire pit. None of us had touched it. We helped him look, but it was gone. We searched around the camp area for maybe 20 minutes, even retraced the trail a bit, in case he dropped it when we left to check out the lake. No luck. Jake started to get pissed, saying someone must have taken it. Brandon and Tyler joked about raccoons stealing electronics, but Jake wasn't laughing. We kept looking until the light started to fade. Eventually, we gave up and figured maybe it fell into the underbrush and we'd find it in the morning. Jake was quiet through dinner. I noticed he kept glancing into the woods while he ate. I didn't say anything, but I had that same unsettled feeling. Not fear, just off. After eating, we sat around the fire for a while. Tyler tried to get us to play cards, but no one felt like it. The fire crackled, but none of us said much. It got colder, and we all turned in early. I zipped into my sleeping bag, listening to the branches move in the wind. Just before I fell asleep, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond our camp. That evening, just before sunset, we went down to the lake to clean up and refill water bottles. The surface of the water was calm, reflecting the trees around it like glass. Brandon was crouched at the edge, scooping water through his filter, when he called out, "Guys, come here." His voice wasn't loud, but something in his tone made all three of us move fast. He didn't look up, just pointed. About 50 yards from where we had found the skull earlier that day, down a slope and half hidden under brush, was a decaying animal body, the same size as the skull. It had no head, and the front legs were twisted under like it had dropped straight down. The body was dried out and sunken, but still recognizable. It had clearly been there for a few weeks, but it wasn't totally decomposed. The weird part wasn't just the carcass, it was what was beside it. There was a roll of old photo film, partially unspooled, sitting next to the body like someone had just left it there. Around the carcass, someone had laid out developed photographs, about 20 of them, each one held in place by small rocks. We walked up slowly. Every single picture showed that same animal, dead, decaying, but from different angles. Close-ups, wide shots, a few taken from high above like someone climbed a tree. The photos were clean and glossy, not weathered. They looked like they'd been developed recently and placed here maybe a day or two ago. It didn't feel like something that happened by accident. No one said much at first. We just stood there in a semicircle, staring down at the ground, barely breathing. The air around us felt different, still, heavy. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Jake knelt and flipped one of the photos over. Blank. No dates, no notes. Just clean white paper on the back. Tyler scanned the tree line and kept turning around like he expected someone to be standing behind us. Brandon stepped carefully around the carcass and pointed at the ground. There were boot prints in the dirt. Not deep, but enough to tell someone had been there recently. The tread looked sharp, not worn down like ours. Jake started checking around the rocks and found 3 more small black canisters, the kind you get with old-school film rolls. All of them were empty, the caps off, tossed neatly under the same type of rocks that held the pictures in place. None of us had seen anyone since day 1, and we'd been off the main trail for a while. Whoever did this didn't just kill an animal and leave it. They documented it, framed it, left it for someone, maybe us, to find. Brandon whispered, "He's been here. Like, this week." Nobody argued. Tyler didn't even joke, which was rare for him. I kept checking the tree line, then the ridge, then back down the path we'd come from. It felt like we were being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. We'd spent half the day hanging around here, walking trails, leaving gear at camp. If someone had been nearby, they could have seen everything. We weren't hidden. We weren't quiet. Whoever had done this might have been sitting in the trees the whole time, just watching. We didn't vote. We just moved. We got back to the camp and packed everything as fast as we could. Tent stakes yanked out without care, food crammed into bags, bear rope cut down instead of untied. I left my ground mat. Jake forgot one of his gloves. No one said a word about it. We just moved. The sun was fading fast, and the trail wasn't friendly in the dark, but we didn't care. We hiked 2, maybe 3 miles over rough terrain before we stopped. The new spot wasn't as nice. Uneven ground, smaller trees, but it was far from the lake, far from the skull, far from those photos. We didn't light a fire. 8 trail bars in silence. Everyone kept their headlamps on, the beams sweeping around like searchlights. Every twig snap, every rustle made us jump. Once, a raccoon came close, and Tyler nearly hit it with a rock. Around midnight, it got cold, but no one zipped up. No one wanted to feel trapped inside a bag if something, or someone, walked into camp. We all lay there stiff, eyes open, listening. I don't think I slept more than an hour. By morning, we agreed without speaking to cut the trip short. We made it out of the mountains in 4 days instead of 7. Took a different trail back to the car, no long breaks, no scenic detours. Just straight walking, heads down, checking behind us every half hour. When we got back to the lot, it was nearly empty. A few dusty cars, no rangers. We talked about reporting what we found, but didn't. No one wanted to get pulled into something bigger. No one wanted to explain why we touched the photos, moved stuff. We just wanted to get home, to forget about it. But I haven't. Sometimes I see those photos in my head again, laid out like a gallery. Who takes that many pictures of a rotting animal and comes back to organize them like that? Who hikes out into the mountains carrying film, a camera, a developing kit, and time to kill? And what were they practicing for? Because that's what it felt like. Practice. Testing things out. Getting used to the steps. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone. I stick to busy trails, near towns. I don't camp more than a night or two. And if I ever see something that looks off, anything like that skull, I turn around. I don't look closer. I don't investigate. I don't want to find out what happens next. Two years back, 5 of us put together this big rafting and camping trip through the rivers in the West Virginia mountains. It was something we'd talked about for a while, but we didn't have enough time or money until that summer. We finally got 2 weeks off work, and we were all in. It was me, my brother Sam, his girlfriend Lisa, and 2 of our close friends, Marcus and David. We all chipped in to rent solid rafting gear, helmets, dry bags, 2 inflatable rafts, paddles, the whole thing. We packed enough food for 2 weeks, 2 tents, a camp stove, some fishing rods, and a backup radio we could use in case of emergency. Our plan was to move from one river to another, sleeping at different spots along the way. We launched near a small put-in point by Summersville, and spent the first day getting used to the flow and working as a team. The rivers were peaceful for the most part, with a few rougher sections, but nothing wild. We'd done a little whitewater stuff before on weekend trips, but this was a different level of commitment. The first 7 days were honestly great. Weather was perfect, sunny, breezy, a little rain here and there, but nothing major. We paddled through some beautiful spots, big tree canopies, clear water, rocky bends. At night, we'd set up camp on high ground, cook over the fire, and just hang out. Lisa brought a small speaker, so we had some music, and Marcus always told these crazy stories from his job working at a car lot. David mostly kept to himself, but helped with gear, and made some great meals with canned stuff and spices he brought in a Ziploc bag. By the 6th day, we'd gotten into a routine. Wake up around 7, break camp, eat a quick breakfast, raft for a few hours, stop for lunch, then keep going until we found a good place to stay for the night. I remember thinking how smooth it was going, like we were really pulling it off. None of us had any idea things were about to change. On day 8, the weather shifted fast. We were moving through a slower stretch of river when we noticed dark clouds piling up behind the hills. In less than an hour, it turned into a full-on thunderstorm. We didn't have time to find real shelter. Lightning was flashing every few seconds, and the thunder felt like it was sitting on top of us. The rain was loud, so loud we had to shout to hear each other, and even then, it barely worked. Sam pointed to a low area on the left bank where there were some trees. We pulled over, tied down the rafts as best we could, and huddled under the thickest branches we could find. The storm lasted all night. The ground turned to mud, and everything was soaked, including our gear. We had emergency ponchos, but they didn't help much with the wind blowing sideways. None of us slept. I just sat with my back against a rock, watching the trees bend and trying not to think about how close the lightning sounded. Once, something big fell in the woods behind us, maybe a tree, but we didn't go check. By morning, the storm had passed, but the river was way higher than before. It looked angrier, faster. There was debris floating by, branches, trash, even a piece of someone's deck. We packed up in silence. Everything was wet. David tried to light a small fire, but the wood was too soaked. So we ate some dry granola and energy bars and pushed off. The plan was to paddle down a few miles until we found a better place to rest and maybe try some fishing while the water calmed down. Sam pointed out an eddy behind a cluster of boulders about a mile ahead where the current was slower. We beached both rafts and pulled them up past the waterline. Marcus said it would be smart to walk up the riverbank for a bit, see if we could find a calm pool or inlet where the fish might be biting. We left the rafts and gear behind, just brought one of the rods and a couple of water bottles. The trail was narrow and muddy, winding through thick trees and low brush. We weren't really talking, just walking in single file, moving slow. Every now and then I'd hear something snap in the woods and freeze, but it always turned out to be nothing, just squirrels or branches. About 15 minutes in, Sam stopped and pointed through the trees. "There," he said. We stepped out of the brush into a small clearing not far from the river. At first, it looked like a normal campsite. Flat ground, fire pit made of stones, some old burnt logs. But then I noticed how messed up everything was. The fire pit was half collapsed and full of trash. There were ripped pieces of tarp, one half-buried sleeping bag soaked with mud, and a pair of ruined sneakers sitting a few feet away. One was melted at the toe. Nearby, I saw a cracked cooler lying open, empty inside except for a bunch of flies buzzing around some blackened scraps. "Jesus," Marcus said, moving forward. He nudged the cooler with his foot, then turned to me. "What the hell happened here?" I didn't answer. I was looking at the trees behind the camp. There were deep cuts in the bark, like someone had taken a hatchet or knife and hacked at them over and over. One trunk had something carved into it. Not words, just long vertical slashes, uneven and deep. Lisa didn't come into the clearing. She stood at the edge, arms crossed. "Guys," she said, "we should leave." David walked toward a pile of fabric near the edge of the fire pit. He crouched down and poked it with a stick. It was a jacket. Moldy, with dark stains on one sleeve and a ripped collar. No ID, no wallet, just a cigarette lighter in one pocket. He flipped it open. The inside was burned black. Nobody said anything for a long time. The place felt abandoned, but not for long. There were beer cans that hadn't rusted yet. A broken phone charger plugged into a portable battery. The battery still had one light flashing. I picked it up and tried the power button. Nothing. We didn't split up. That was the unspoken rule now. Marcus moved left around the edge of the site, checking the backside where the trees thickened again. I kept my eyes on the river, maybe 30 yards downhill. From here you could barely see it through the leaves. Lisa stepped back suddenly and said, louder, "Guys, someone's coming." 3 tents stood collapsed, the fabric shredded like someone had taken blades to them. The cuts were long, clean, not like what you'd expect from an animal. Clothes were scattered around in the mud, some half-buried, some torn, but most just tossed aside. I saw a rolled-up sleeping pad slashed straight through. But nothing valuable was missing. High-end hiking packs, still zipped and full. A camp stove sitting on its side, barely scratched. 2 water filters and a first aid kit were half-buried near a log, untouched. Lisa found a pair of trekking poles snapped in half, not chewed, broken deliberately. A few feet away there was a thick wallet lying in the mud. She picked it up with 2 fingers, flipped it open. ID, credit cards, over $100 in cash. All still there. "No one robbed this place," she said quietly. The strangest thing was the bear canister. Someone had hung it high up in a tree, about 25 feet, well beyond reach from the ground. That's normal for food safety. But the container was ripped open from the top. Torn metal, the lid bent outward like it had been pried with something stronger than a crowbar. Whatever did, that didn't use claws. David pointed out a bundle of climbing gear near one tent. The ropes were frayed, but not worn or old, cut cleanly, like with a blade. He lifted one and ran his thumb across the edge. "This wasn't animals," he said. "This was a knife." Nobody said anything for a long moment. The forest around us felt too quiet. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting movement, but everything stayed still. "Why would someone leave all this?" Sam finally asked. "They didn't pack anything. They just ran." We didn't go deeper into the woods. We turned back, fast. Back at the rafts, we pulled out the satellite phone we brought for emergencies and called the park authorities. We didn't know what else to do. The signal was weak, but we got through. I told the dispatcher what we found. Abandoned campsite, no people, gear left behind, signs of something violent. She said there were no reports of missing hikers or distress calls from that area within the last 10 days. Told us not to touch anything else, just mark the location and send coordinates. While I was on the phone with her, Marcus came running down from the trail with mud on his jeans. He waved for us to follow. About 30 feet past the clearing, in a soft patch of earth, he'd found drag marks. Deep grooves in the mud, like someone had pulled something heavy. They were long and uneven, weaving between trees. It didn't look like tracks, more like someone dragging a person, or maybe more than one. There were spots where the pattern broke, then started again. Whatever it was, it had been moved forcefully. Sam called out. He was holding a small black camera with a broken strap, a digital one. He'd found it half buried in the roots of a tree, still powered on. The last few photos were dated just 2 days earlier. First shots were normal. Smiling people, someone pitching a tent, another person posing with a fish, then a group photo by the fire. The last picture was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. It showed a guy in a hoodie roasting marshmallows. Fire glowing, everyone calm. Nothing weird, nothing out of place. That was the end. No final photo showing panic. No sign of the storm we'd just seen. Just a normal camp scene. Peaceful. We didn't argue about staying. Nobody wanted to. We sent the GPS coordinates to the authorities and packed everything fast. No one said much. We didn't even eat lunch. Just threw gear back in the rafts and got on the river. We paddled hard, straight down toward the next takeout point. Skipped the planned stops. Didn't bother to fish. By dusk, we were at a ranger station near the highway. We told the staff there what we found, handed over the camera, gave a full report. A search team went out that same night. A week later, a ranger called me. He said they'd found the camp exactly as we described it. Still no sign of the people. They collected all the gear and processed it, but there were no blood traces, no IDs beyond the wallet, no footprints leading out. Nothing. The bear canister was still hanging, still ripped open. The official report said it was likely a bear attack, maybe black bears going after food. But none of it made sense. The ropes were cut. The tents were slashed with straight edges. And no bear climbs 25 feet to tear open a sealed container from above. No signs of struggle. No bodies. The ranger told me to consider the area closed to visitors until further notice. We never went back. Lisa sold her kayak the next month. Marcus deleted all the trip photos from his phone. David started talking about getting a camper instead of doing wilderness trips. Even Sam didn't argue. And I've never camped deep in the woods since then. When people ask me why I don't do long trips anymore, I just say, we saw something we shouldn't have. Sometimes in the wild you come across something that's better left alone. Not everything has to be explained. Not everything leaves answers. Sometimes you just walk away. In 2019, I was working as a crime reporter for a regional newspaper in West Virginia. It wasn't the most exciting beat, mostly local arrests, minor burglaries, sometimes drug stuff. Things changed when I first heard about Robert Clark. It came through a state police bulletin that was forwarded to our newsroom. Just a brief note about a missing hiker and a person of interest last seen near the Blue Ridge sector. The name didn't mean much to me at the time, but I flagged it because it mentioned a military background. Clark was 52 when his name started popping up more. He used to be a sergeant in the army and had done 3 tours in Afghanistan. The records we later pulled confirmed he was honorably discharged, but his last deployment was rough. According to a source from the VA hospital in Richmond, he came back with intense PTSD. His wife left him a year after he returned. He lost his job not long after that. From what I gathered, he refused any kind of therapy or medication, just wanted to disappear. By 2015, he had no permanent address. DMV records showed his last vehicle was an early 2000s Dodge van registered in North Carolina. Park rangers along the Appalachian Trail corridor said he started appearing regularly around then. Always alone, usually camping a good distance off the trail. They knew him by name and said he never bothered anyone. No fires, no noise, no trash. He was one of those guys who could survive weeks with nothing but a knife and some dried food. Most hikers didn't even notice him. There was no criminal record, no violence, no threats. The man had simply vanished from society, living in the woods. To most people, he was just another vet trying to find some peace. That changed fast. The first person tied to his case was Jennifer Wright. She was a 38-year-old school teacher from a town outside Baltimore. Taught science at a middle school and spent most of her summer break section hiking the Appalachian Trail. Her goal was to finish the whole thing in 5 years, breaking it into chunks during school vacations. In June 2019, she told a friend she planned to cover a stretch in Virginia between Buchanan and Daleville. Just 5 days out. She was organized, had a GPS tracker, a detailed print map, emergency whistle, the works. Her car was found parked in a gravel lot near the trailhead, right where it was supposed to be. But she never signed in at the check-in station farther down the trail. That's usually optional, but she was the kind of hiker who always checked in. When she didn't return 5 days later, her friend reported her missing. Search teams from 3 counties were brought in. They used dogs, drones, helicopters, the works. It was hard terrain, steep climbs, lots of rock slides, deep forest with almost no cell reception. 2 weeks went by with nothing. Then, a pair of volunteers found something in a ravine about 12 miles from the trailhead. It was a torn sleeping bag and part of a nylon backpack wedged under some brush. 20 yards down, they saw a body. She was lying face down on a patch of mossy rock, maybe 40 feet from the main hiking path. Her shoes were missing. So was her GPS device. At first they thought she fell, but when the medical examiner released the report, it said blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. No other injuries. Just one heavy, deliberate strike. There were no animal marks, no sign of sexual assault. Her wallet and ID were still in a side pouch. Police ran prints, looked at known offenders. Nothing came up. No witnesses, no trail cam footage. Just a single boot print found near the edge of the ravine. Size 12, standard military issue. It wasn't much, and they couldn't even confirm it was from the suspect. But it was enough to get attention. After the autopsy confirmed it was a homicide, ranger patrols increased all along that section of the trail. But the AT is over 2,000 miles long, cutting through 14 states. Covering that kind of area is basically impossible. They posted signs warning solo hikers to be cautious, especially women. But most people who hike that trail are experienced and tend to ignore those kinds of alerts. By fall, the case had gone cold. I tried to keep writing about it, but the paper moved on. No one had seen anything, and there were no new bodies. They didn't even have a suspect's name. Clark wasn't on anyone's radar yet. He wasn't in any database because he'd never been arrested. He didn't have active warrants. If you asked the police then, they'd say it was a random tragedy, maybe someone passing through, maybe a drug thing, maybe even another hiker who snapped. I remember someone from the sheriff's office telling me, people disappear in those woods all the time. But Jennifer didn't just disappear. She was found. And someone had made sure of that. 8 months later, it happened again. This time it was an older couple, Frank and Dorothy Martinez, both in their 70s. They were from Pennsylvania and had been slowly working their way through the Appalachian Trail for nearly a decade. This trip was supposed to be their final leg, a short celebratory hike in North Carolina to complete the journey. Their daughter said they called every night and posted regular updates online, photos of trail markers, lunches on flat rocks, notes about the weather. On day 3, the calls stopped. No new photos, no posts, no answers. Rescue teams started looking within 24 hours. They were found a week later. Both bodies were lying in a narrow clearing, off a side path nearly 2 miles from the marked trail. They had no visible gunshot wounds, no stab wounds. But the coroner later confirmed they had been struck in the head, just like Jennifer Wright. Same pattern, same type of wound. One hit, deliberate. Their backpacks were nearby, untouched. No valuables taken. Nothing staged. It looked like they were just marched off the trail and killed. There were new details this time. A faint tire track near the access road matched a van. Not enough for a plate number, but consistent with the kind of van park rangers said Clark drove back when he first started wandering the trail. One ranger from Georgia even mentioned seeing a man matching his description a few weeks prior. Said he was quiet, polite, bought trail mix and water, and asked about off-map shelters. Still, there was no name. Clark remained invisible to every system. No licenses, no credit cards, no active bank account. After the Martinez case, the FBI took over. They set up a dedicated task force for what they now believed was an active serial killer targeting hikers. Posters were distributed to every ranger station along the trail. The Bureau asked for any info about a lone man in his 50s, possibly living out of a van, possibly former military. They didn't know who they were looking for, but they knew the pattern. Always a quiet section of the trail. Always solo or vulnerable hikers. No robbery. Just silent, controlled killings. Then it happened again. Her name was Ashley Davis, 26, a grad student from Ohio. She was taking a break between semesters and decided to hike a week-long section in Virginia. She'd been posting regularly on Instagram. Most of her photos were of rivers, trees, basic camp setups. Her last post was a selfie near a shallow stream, tent already up behind her. She looked relaxed. Normal. The next morning she didn't text her mom as she usually did. Search teams moved fast this time. They knew the signs. They scoured the area around her last known location, near a small stream 2 miles off Skyline Drive. Her tent was still there, partially collapsed. Her boots were gone. So was her phone and flashlight. Witnesses came forward. A couple from Michigan said they'd seen an old gray van in the parking lot that morning, parked awkwardly along the edge. Another hiker recalled chatting with a scruffy older man near the stream. He looked like a vet, he said. You could just tell. For the first time, they had a solid lead. They ran a sketch, circulated it fast. A ranger in Tennessee recognized the man. He'd seen him staying at a primitive campground under the name Rick Hansen. Local deputies moved in. Clark didn't resist. In fact, he seemed calm. He had a fake ID, 2 knives, a loaded handgun, and several spiral-bound notebooks filled with names, trail segments, and detailed entries about different hikers he'd observed. He confessed during the first interview. All 3 killings. He said he picked his targets carefully, always watched them first. He liked solo hikers, especially ones who moved slowly, who stayed quiet, who didn't make calls too often. Said they reminded him of insurgents. When you're in the field, he told the agent, you study the pattern, you wait, then you take them before they know you're there. That was all he said before he shut down and asked for a lawyer. The trial didn't take long. Clark pleaded guilty to all charges. The judge gave him 3 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole. During sentencing, the judge looked directly at him and said, "Your service is not a shield. It does not excuse what you became." Clark said nothing, just stared at the floor. The FBI's post-arrest investigation uncovered more. They found dozens of pages of notes, including sketches of campsites and makeshift maps. Clark had photographed hikers from a distance, sometimes multiple times, sometimes months apart. He tracked their routines, gear, even sleep patterns. It became clear he had been planning each attack with military precision. Security on the Appalachian Trail changed after that. The Conservancy worked with law enforcement to install new emergency beacons at remote trail points. More rangers were deployed, and signage was updated to warn hikers not to camp alone. Shared tracking apps were pushed through hiking forums, encouraging people to check in with contacts daily. Clark was sent to a federal maximum security prison in Colorado. According to a report, he has refused any interviews since arriving. No contact with the outside, no appeals. The families of the victims came together after the trial. They launched a foundation focused on solo hiking safety, training programs, GPS device distribution, awareness campaigns. I interviewed them once for a follow-up piece. They said the goal was to make sure no one else's daughter, wife, or parents vanished without a trace. Law enforcement changed how they coordinate across state lines after that. A national system for missing persons on long-distance trails was implemented. Cases don't get lost in county lines anymore. It took 3 lives and months of silence, but something shifted after Clark. Something lasting. I used to work as a surveyor for the State Forestry Department. My partner Steve Clark and I handled trail assessments, especially after storms or fires. We'd been paired for 3 years and had a rhythm. He was more adventurous, always poking around, while I was more focused on finishing the job and getting back home. After Hurricane Rita tore through the area, the department sent us out to the Appalachian Trails to check damage. We were told to hike out to a section near mile marker 47. That Tuesday morning we packed up early and drove out to the access point. The sun was barely up when we started the climb. It was humid. The air still felt heavy from the storm a few days before. Fallen branches and torn up brush made the hike slower than usual. The trail was chewed up bad. Trees ripped clean from the ground, soil eroded along the slopes. Even parts of the wooden walkway were gone. We stopped every 100 feet or so to note major damage. By the time we reached the spot near mile 47, I was already tired of scrambling over debris and wiping sweat off my neck. Steve, as always, was upbeat, climbing over a tangle of downed trees like it was a playground. The biggest obstruction was a massive oak that had landed right across the path. Looked like it had snapped at the base and rolled downhill before slamming into a boulder. The thing was about 3 feet thick and still green despite being on its side. We didn't have saws, just basic gear, so we started clearing the smaller limbs around it, marking the GPS and taking photos for the repair crew. Steve climbed over the trunk to check the downhill side and called me over. "There's something under here," he said. I stepped around to look. At first it just looked like packed dirt under the tree, but when we cleared more brush, we found a rectangular outline, a concrete slab buried in the slope. About 6 by 4 feet, with metal hinges on one side and a thick metal handle. There were faded triangle-shaped signs bolted to the top, barely visible through grime and dirt. Steve took a glove and wiped one of them off. The words were faded but readable. "Radiation Hazard, U.S. Civil Defense, 1963. I immediately stepped back. "We should mark this and call it in. This isn't trail work." Steve crouched lower. "Come on, man. It's probably just an old fallout shelter. We're already here." The slab had a metal door built into it, like a hatch, and it was slightly open. Not enough to see inside, but you could tell it hadn't been sealed tight for a while. My gut told me to leave it alone, but Steve was already pulling his flashlight out. I told him again we should report it, but he waved me off, said it'd just take a minute. He yanked the door further open. It let out a screech like it hadn't moved in years. A stale rush of air came up from below, thick and musty. He aimed the flashlight inside. There were concrete steps going down, maybe 10 or 15 feet, with rusted railings along one wall. No markings, no sign of anyone inside. Steve looked back at me and grinned. 5 minutes. Just a quick look." Before I could say anything else, he was already halfway down. I hesitated at the top, but I didn't want him going alone, so I grabbed my own light and followed. The stairs creaked but held our weight. The air was thick, smelled like mold and something metallic. There was no noise except our footsteps and the scrape of Steve's boots ahead of me. The stairway ended at a flat concrete floor. The room was bigger than I expected, maybe 20 feet across. Cinder block walls, no windows, low ceiling with rusted beams. It looked like a bunker from an old war movie. There were shelves against the far wall with what looked like dusty boxes and some metal containers stacked in rows. A table stood in the center, warped and missing one leg, and 2 folding chairs were tipped over nearby. The light from our flashlights flicked across piles of debris, broken glass, and what might have once been canned food, now bloated and leaking. Steve started looking through one of the metal crates while I stayed near the stairs. I didn't like it down there. The place felt too still, like it had been sealed for years. My light caught something shiny near the back corner. Another door. This one was metal too, painted over in the same faded yellow, but newer looking than the rest. It had a keypad, rusted and broken, and no handle. It didn't budge when I pushed on it. "Steve, we've seen enough," I said. "Let's go." He didn't answer at first. I turned to see him kneeling by a wooden crate, lid cracked open. He held up a thick binder with plastic sheets inside, like a catalog. I couldn't read anything from where I stood, but he looked focused, flipping through page after page. I didn't like the look on his face, too quiet, like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't belong here. "Steve." He finally stood, still holding the binder. "There's stuff in here. Like, not just food storage. Papers. Diagrams. Chemical labels I don't recognize." "We're not supposed to be here," I said again. "Let's get out before we mess something up." He looked around once more, then finally nodded. He shoved the binder into his pack and stepped back from the crate. As we turned toward the stairs, something shifted behind us. A dull metallic clank echoed through the room. Steve froze. I spun around, raising my flashlight. The main hatch we came through was still open, but something had moved. A soft scraping noise, metal on concrete, from somewhere beyond the far wall. Steve stepped toward the noise. I grabbed his arm. No, we're done. We started moving fast, retracing our steps back to the stairs. Steve was ahead of me again, almost jogging now. He took the steps 2 at a time, and I followed close behind, my flashlight bouncing across the walls. The air felt thicker somehow, like the space behind us had started to shift. When we got to the top, Steve shoved the hatch wide and hauled himself out. I came up right after, brushing dirt off my shirt and pulling in fresh air. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees. Just the sound of our breathing. We didn't speak much on the hike back. Steve seemed lost in thought, and I kept scanning the trees, ears tuned for anything out of place. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the way that steel door looked, newer than the rest, too clean. It didn't match the decay around it. And those radiation signs, they weren't just for show. We went back the next day. This time, we packed better gear. Respirators, gloves, and backup flashlights. Steve brought a handheld Geiger counter he'd borrowed from a friend at the university. I brought extra water and a roll of red tape to mark our way. We didn't tell anyone where we were going. The hatch door opened easier now. The hinges must have loosened after we moved it the first time. The air inside was heavier than before. Hotter, like something down there had warmed up. We descended again. Slow this time, lights sweeping the corners. The Geiger counter clicked low but steady. Not enough to panic, but not clean either. At the base of the stairs, we turned left through an open doorway. There was a hallway, narrow and lined with rotting insulation. It led into another room, larger than the first. Wooden crates were stacked against the walls, some collapsed, others intact. Steve opened one carefully. Inside were old canvas bags with faded stencils, gas masks, sealed filters, Geiger counters, most still wrapped in their original waxed paper. The deeper we went, the less it felt like a fallout shelter and more like a lab. I found a row of filing cabinets rusted shut except one. It slid open with effort. Inside were manila folders full of typed reports, log entries, test results, inventory checklists. One sheet mentioned field exposure units, material series 14B. Another had a map with the title, Underground Extension, Phase 3 Development. Steve found a panel with a broken radio receiver. As he adjusted the dials, a signal broke through. Short bursts of static, followed by a series of beeps. It repeated every few seconds. Not random. It sounded like a loop, maybe automated. We stood in silence listening to it. It didn't feel right. Something about the sound made the space feel smaller. The chemical smell was stronger now, like burnt plastic mixed with ammonia. I told Steve we should leave. He agreed, reluctantly, and said we'd come back with full suits and masks. I wasn't sure I wanted to. That night Steve wouldn't stop calling me. He was obsessed. Said he'd been thinking about that signal, about the door at the end of the hallway. I told him to let it go for one night. We'd figure it out in the morning. He agreed. But when I woke up the next day, he was already standing in my driveway. He looked pale, eyes unfocused. Said he'd gone back at dawn to get a photo of the metal door. But something had changed. They were there, he kept repeating. They were watching me. Down the corridor, just past the door. I helped him inside. He looked sick. He couldn't stop sweating, and his breathing was shallow. He said they had gas masks, black ones, old-looking, and stood still without saying a word. I didn't know what to think. He wouldn't stop shaking. I got him into the truck and drove straight to the ER. The nurses took him in right away. Later, the doctor came out and said Steve had chemical exposure, some kind of vapor affecting his cognition and balance. It wasn't lethal, but they needed to monitor him. I drove back to the trail alone. Didn't go inside this time. Just rolled the hazard tape across the trees and wrapped it around the hatch. I posted a warning notice on a stake nearby and took pictures for the report I knew I'd have to file. Then I left. I didn't go back that night. The following morning, I called the state emergency office, told them what we found and that my partner had gotten sick. I expected them to say someone would come by next week. Instead, they asked for GPS coordinates and told me to stay off the site. By mid-afternoon, black trucks and military jeeps were crawling up the service road. They didn't waste time. Men in full hazmat suits hauled sealed containers out of the bunker for 2 straight days. We weren't allowed near. One of them told me offhand it was a Cold War test site, classified back then, now forgotten. Something about chemical research and underground material storage. Said it was lucky we didn't open any pressurized chambers. On the 3rd day, they set demolition charges around the entrance. I watched from the ridge as the hillside shook and dust bloomed into the trees. When it cleared, there was nothing left but a crater and some fresh concrete poured over the slope. They never gave us anything in writing, just told us the case was closed and that we were not to mention it in our official work logs. Our GPS records and report drafts were pulled from the department server. A man in uniform gave me a release form to sign. I did. Steve got better after a few weeks. Physically, he was fine, but he never talked about what he saw. Not even once. If I brought it up, he'd change the subject or leave the room. He quit fieldwork the next year and moved to Oregon. We lost touch. Sometimes, I still think about the place. The signal. The locked door with no handle. I still have the dog tag I found on the ground near the entrance the second time we went back. It's plain steel, scratched and worn, but you can still read what's etched into it. Test Site Bravo 7. It stays in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't look at it often, but I don't throw it out either. Some things, I think, are meant to stay buried. I used to work as a vet in a small town tucked into the edge of the Pennsylvania woods. It wasn't busy, just cats with worms and dogs with broken nails most days, but it could get to you. The smell of antiseptic, fluorescent lights, the same small waiting room filled with the same quiet people. To clear my head, I'd take Max, my Labrador, out for evening hikes. Max was 3, golden-colored, always wagging, and had this need to say hi to everyone and everything. He wasn't trained for anything but friendliness. He'd follow chipmunks into bushes, lick toddlers, and nudge old men for head pats. We usually stuck to the same few trails winding through the Appalachians. Locals would nod as we passed, and some even carried dog biscuits in their coat pockets just for Max. 2 years without incident. That Thursday, though, I decided to try something new. There was a lesser-used trail leading to a scenic overlook I'd read about. Only 2 miles from the lot, just steeper than I was used to. Max tugged hard on the leash when we started, tail wagging like mad. He sniffed every root, rock, and bush. The air was cool, a light breeze moving the leaves overhead. The trail had some incline, but nothing serious, just tighter switchbacks and more roots. No cell service, of course, but that was normal out there. I had a flashlight and my usual small med kit in the backpack, same as always. We didn't pass anyone on the way up, which felt odd even for a quiet weekday, but I figured it was just too steep for the regular dog walkers. Max didn't seem to notice the silence. He was focused on tracking scents I couldn't smell. It took us about 40 minutes to reach the overlook. It was a wide open clearing with a wooden fence built along the edge. You could see for miles. Forests, hills, the fading orange sky dipping behind a line of dark trees. I dropped the backpack, unclipped Max's leash, and let him roam. He took off into the edge of the clearing, nose to the ground, tail still moving. I pulled out my phone to snap some pictures. No signal still, but the sunset was worth saving. For about 10 minutes, Max wandered around without a care. I heard him crunching through the dry leaves near the tree line, but never out of sight. There was a stillness to the place. No bird song, no rustling wind. Just the soft padding of Max's paws and the occasional click from my camera. When the sun dipped low, I called out, "Max, come on, let's head back." He jogged over, panting, and I clipped him up again. We made our way back down with less energy than we'd had going up. The sky dimmed fast, and I could just make out the trail beneath the canopy. I flicked on my flashlight. The beam bounced as we walked. Max kept a steady pace, tongue out, eyes forward. A few times he stopped to sniff, but nothing unusual. The crickets had started up, loud in the quiet. We were about halfway down when Max froze. Not slowed down. Froze. Mid-step. He stared to the right, toward a thick clump of mountain laurel. His ears went back. Then I heard it. This low, rough growl rising from his throat. I'd never heard that from him. It wasn't playful or confused. It sounded defensive. Mean. I stopped and followed his gaze. I couldn't see anything in the underbrush, just dense leaves and shadows. I called his name. Max. Nothing. I tugged his leash a bit. He didn't move. His front paw lifted like he was about to lunge. That growl stayed low but steady, rumbling. I looked around. The trail behind us was clear. The way forward was tight, winding into more darkness. No sign of people. No sound but the insects. I leaned in closer, raised the flashlight, and aimed it at the brush. The light cut through some of the branches, but not all. I thought I saw something shift, just barely. A change in shadow. Max barked, one short, loud snap. Then silence again. I called louder. "Hey, is someone there?" No answer. My voice sounded too thin, like it got eaten up by the trees. I didn't want to take another step forward. I didn't want to turn my back either. Max didn't move. His body was tense now, like a statue. Every part of him pointed toward that patch of green. Then his back leg twitched, and he started growling again, louder. Max backed up into me, his body pressed tight against my legs. I could feel the tension all through him, shaking in waves under his fur. His tail curled under, and the fur along his spine was raised like a ridge. I crouched down to calm him, but his eyes stayed locked on the same patch of laurel. It was too dark and too thick to make anything out. The flashlight beam didn't help much. It just lit up a wall of tangled branches. I listened hard, holding my breath. Nothing. No rustling. No bugs. Just stillness, like the woods were holding their breath too. Max gave a low whimper and nudged my thigh with his nose, then pulled back again. His leash was taut. He gave it another jerk, harder this time, like he wanted to turn and run. I didn't say anything. I just gave one last look into the brush, then slowly stood and turned with him. That kind of fear wasn't normal for him. Max didn't scare easy. He was the kind of dog that barked at his own reflection and tried to play with squirrels. This was something else. I kept the flashlight low and followed his lead, one hand tight on the leash, the other gripping the small can of pepper spray I always kept in my pack, even if I'd never needed it before. He pulled harder once we were facing downhill again, fast, not waiting for me to catch up. I clipped the leash properly to my belt just in case, and we started moving. It wasn't a walk anymore. Max was almost dragging me. His paws hit the dirt in a frantic rhythm. He kept glancing over his shoulder, whining between fast breaths. I tried to stay upright on the uneven path, but I had to jog to match his speed. My flashlight bounced with each step, flashing across tree trunks and low ferns. My ears were straining for any sound behind us, anything in the brush, but all I could hear was Max's panting and the slap of our steps on the ground. About 100 yards down, Max suddenly pulled even harder, nearly yanking me off balance. I had to grab a tree trunk for support. He wouldn't stop, wouldn't even pause to let me catch my breath. He was panicked in a way I didn't fully understand, but I trusted it. I let him lead. Every few seconds he looked back again, and not at me, past me, up the trail. I turned the flashlight behind us once, but saw nothing. Just trees, just dark. But I felt watched, like something was still there, still hidden. We reached the lot faster than I thought possible. I barely remembered the turns we took to get there. Max lunged ahead when he saw the car. I hit the unlock button and opened the back door. He didn't wait. He jumped inside and curled up on the floor behind the seats. He didn't even try to sit up or look around like usual. Just stayed low, nose tucked under his front legs, shivering. I closed the door and got behind the wheel. My hands shook when I tried to start the engine. The headlights lit up the trail entrance and a few parked cars, but the woods behind that still looked pitch black. I didn't waste time. I backed out and drove. Max didn't make a sound the whole ride back. No window sniffing, no watching cars or leaning into turns. He just stayed curled up in that tight ball. The silence in the car felt strange. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror to check on him, half expecting him to snap out of it, but he stayed still. I pulled into the driveway and opened the back door, but he didn't move. I had to coax him out gently, and even then, he didn't run for the yard like normal. He walked straight inside and lay down in the hallway, still trembling. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept going over what had happened. The trail, the silence, the way Max reacted. I replayed his growl in my head. I'd heard him bark 100 times, but never like that. It stuck with me. I finally got up around 6 and called the state park office. A ranger picked up, and I told him what happened, where we were, how Max reacted, the total silence in the woods. He asked a few follow-up questions, then got quiet. After a pause, he said, "That matches a few other reports. We've had 3 confirmed mountain lion sightings in that area this month. One hiker said he was followed for a while, half a mile maybe, before the cat disappeared." I didn't know what to say to that. The ranger added, "Dogs usually pick up on them way before people do. Your lab probably sensed it watching you. Could have been close." I thanked him and hung up. That same afternoon, they closed the trail. Not permanently, just until the wildlife guys could go check things out. I didn't argue. It made sense. Something was up there. Something Max knew to fear. For a few days after that, he stayed skittish. Jumped at small sounds. Refused to go near the car. But slowly, he went back to his normal self. Tail wagging, headbutting me for treats. I never took him back to that trail. Not in the evening. Not ever. We stick to the popular loops now, where there are always other hikers, dogs, noise. And I always watch Max more than I watch the path. If he stops, I stop. If he growls, we turn around. I don't argue. Some instincts are built to be trusted. Max saved us that night. I don't plan to test that luck again.